Hey guys, tonight we're going to explore one of history's most impossible secrets, how Roman soldiers were paid not in gold or silver, but in something that seems almost absurd when you first hear it. Salt. Yes, that stuff sitting in a shaker on your table right now. The thing you sprinkle on fries without thinking twice. That humble white crystal once determined who lived, who prospered, and who ruled the ancient world. Before we step into this strange economy of white gold, do me a favor. If you enjoy these deep dives into history's forgotten corners, hit that like button and subscribe. I promise I only ask when it actually helps the channel grow. And if you're listening from somewhere far from Rome, somewhere I've probably never been, leave a comment with your city and the time where you are right now. I genuinely love knowing where in the world these mysteries are traveling to, what time zones are drifting off to sleep with ancient Roman soldiers in their minds. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The leather pouch hits your palm with a heavy, crystalline chime. Not the clink of metal on metal, this sound is softer, more delicate, like snow settling on a stone roof or sand shifting in a glass timer. You open the drawstring and look inside. White crystals catch the midday sun, gleaming like trapped moonlight, each facet reflecting the sky above in miniature mirrors too small to count, is less than has own. Arting ho dayu. You lift the pouch and weigh it in your hand. 3 libre. About 2¼ pounds in the measurements you'd use today, but in the measurements that matter to you, a Roman soldier stationed somewhere on the empire's endless frontier. This is enough to buy bread for a month. New sandals for the next march. 3 nights of proper lodging when you finally reach Rome, if you ever make it back to the capital. Your fingers work their way into the coarse crystals, feeling the sharp edges, the irregular shapes, the faintest trace of moisture still clinging to each one like the memory of the sea they came from. Some crystals are large and chunky, the size of a fingernail, catching light in obvious ways. Others are fine as powder, slipping through your fingers like time itself, too small to hold but still valuable, still precious, still essential. Bring it to your nose. The smell hits you like a memory you didn't know you had, sharp, primal, somehow ancient beyond anything words can capture. It's the scent of every coastal breeze you've ever tasted, every wave that's broken against the hull of a transport ship, every storm you've watched from the walls of a frontier fort while wondering if the gods were angry or just bored. This salt has traveled farther than you have, seen more coastlines than you'll ever see, passed through more hands than you can imagine. Around you, the century falls into the same ritual. 80 men, each with their own pouch of white crystals, each performing the same unconscious assessment, weighing, smelling, calculating what this means for their next month of survival. No one speaks. There's only the rustle of leather, the soft crystal-on-crystal whisper that sounds like distant waves, and the far-off murmur of the camp beyond the paymaster's tent, going about its endless business of being an army. The paymaster watches with practiced indifference, his face a map of bureaucratic boredom you've come to recognize in every corner of the empire. He's done this 1,000 times already this morning. Will do it 1,000 times before the sun sets. His eyes are slightly unfocused, his jaw slack, the movements of his hands automatic as breathing record the name, weigh the salt, hand it over, call the next name, repeat until the line ends or the world ends, whichever comes first. But you don't take your eyes off the white crystals in your palm. They catch the light in 100 tiny facets, each one a miniature mirror reflecting the sun, the sky, your own face peering down at them with an expression you can't quite read. Impossible to count how many crystals are here. Impossible to imagine the ocean they came from, the hands that harvested them from shallow ponds under this same sun, the ships that carried them across waters you've never seen, the warehouses where they waited in the dark for this exact moment. You close your fist around the pouch. The crystals press against your skin through the leather, sharp, cool, inexorably present in a way that makes them feel more real than the ground beneath your feet. This is your pay. This is what you marched across 3 provinces for, what you spent 3 years of your life guarding the frontier for, what the man who used to sleep in the bunk next to yours died of a fever for last winter before he ever got to spend a single crystal of it. Not silver, not gold, not bronze coins stamped with the emperor's face, which would at least feel like proper money, like the kind of thing that belongs in a soldier's pay. Sal. The thought still has the power to unsettle you, even after all these years in the Legion, even though you've been paid this way 100 times before, and will be paid this way 100 times more, if you're lucky enough to survive that long. Back home, and home feels like a dream now, something that might have happened to someone else in a different life. Salt was something your mother kept in a small clay jar on the kitchen shelf. You remember watching her hands, dusted with white powder, moving over the evening porridge with the precision of someone performing a sacred ritual. A pinch here, a pinch there, never more than absolutely necessary, because salt was precious in a way that bread and olive oil and even wine weren't precious. The way she'd close the jar with such care, as if she were sealing something that could escape into the air and disappear forever, leaving the family's meals bland and barely edible. Now you hold enough salt in this one pouch to last your entire family 2 years, maybe 3 if they were careful, and your mother applied her usual discipline to stretching every resource as far as it would go. The absurdity of it hits you sometimes in the quiet moments between marches, during the endless night watches when the camp is asleep and you're alone with your thoughts and the distant sounds of the frontier darkness. A soldier of Rome paid in the same crystals that a cook uses to flavor a stew. It should feel degrading somehow, like you're being compensated with kitchen scraps instead of proper money. But it doesn't feel that way at all. Because you've seen what salt can do. You've watched it transform meat that would rot in a single day into provisions that last for months, carrying legions across deserts and mountains where no fresh food exists. You've tasted the difference between a meal with salt and a meal without it. The first is food that makes you want to live. The second is barely worth the effort of chewing and swallowing. You've watched wounded soldiers lick salt from their hands when clean water ran scarce, their bodies knowing something their minds couldn't articulate, some deep animal wisdom that understands salt is life in its most concentrated form. You've seen men die from lack of it, their bodies slowly failing in ways that no doctor could explain, but that every veteran recognized the salt sickness, they called it. The thing that happens when you march too long in too much heat and sweat out more salt than you can replace. The line moves forward. Another name called. Another pouch weighed with bureaucratic precision. Another soldier receives his white fortune and steps away, face unreadable, thoughts private. You secure the drawstring and slip the pouch into the money belt at your waist, the one designed specifically for this purpose, with its reinforced stitching and waterproof lining that protects your pay from rain and river crossings. The pouch settles against your hip, heavier than coins would be, more substantial somehow, like you're carrying actual weight instead of just the symbolic representation of value. This weight will travel with you on tomorrow's march, in the negotiations at the next town's market, in the bathhouse when you finally reach Rome and can afford to pay for hot water and a proper scraping. Every step you take from this moment forward, these crystals will move with you, a constant reminder of what you've earned and what it's worth, and how strange it is to live in a world where these two things are the same. The sun climbs higher, turning the parade ground into a furnace that bakes the breath from your lungs. Heat shimmers off the packed earth in visible waves, making the distant buildings waver like they're underwater. Dust motes dance in the shafts of light, cutting through the paymaster's tent, each tiny particle catching the sun and glowing like a microscopic crystal, like the whole world is made of salt if you just look close enough. Somewhere beyond the camp walls, a merchant is setting up his stall for the day's business, arranging his wares with care, calculating in his head what he'll accept in exchange for his goods. He'll take silver. Of course, silver is always welcome, always trusted, always worth exactly what it weighs. He'll take bronze if he has to, though he'll grumble about it and adjust his prices accordingly, because bronze is heavy and not particularly valuable, and he'll have to carry it to the next town to exchange it for something better. But his eyes will light up when you show him your salt. You've seen this transformation 100 times, the way a merchant's whole demeanor changes when salt enters the negotiation, the way prices suddenly become flexible, the way goods that were supposedly sold out suddenly become available again. Salt is better than money in some ways, more trusted, more universally valued, because everyone needs it and everyone knows exactly what it's worth. Everyone needs salt. The rich need it to preserve their exotic delicacies, the imported fish and foreign fruits that define their status. The poor need it to make their endless grain bearable, to transform the same porridge they eat every single day into something that tastes like food instead of paste. The living need it to stay alive, to keep their bodies functioning in ways that no one fully understands but everyone knows are essential. The dead well, the dead don't need anything anymore, but salt will keep them from smelling like death while their families prepare the funeral, which is its own kind of gift in a world where bodies don't last long in the heat. 字数2089. You've heard stories about the old days, passed down from veteran to recruit in the quiet hours between watch rotations, stories that might be true or might be the kind of legend that soldiers tell themselves to make sense of the absurdity of their lives. Stories about the time before the salt roads were established, before every legion had its own supply lines and official salt depots scattered across the provinces like breadcrumbs, marking the path of Roman expansion. Stories about soldiers who went months without pay, not because the empire had no money, but because the shipments couldn't get through bandits on the roads, storms at sea, bureaucratic incompetence in some warehouse somewhere that no one ever bothered to correct. Stories about mutinies that started over nothing more than a shortage of white crystals, entire cohorts refusing to march until their salarium arrived, officers trying to explain that silver was just as good, while knowing it absolutely wasn't. There's one story in particular that everyone knows, though no one can quite agree on the details because it happened decades ago and facts have a way of becoming flexible when they pass through enough mouths. The paymaster's predecessor, 2 or 3 generations back, depending on who's telling it, made a mistake with the salt shipments. Maybe he sold half the supply on the side to line his own purse, or maybe he genuinely miscalculated and didn't order enough, or maybe the shipment was stolen and he tried to cover it up. Whatever the reason, an entire century was paid half their usual portion. Not half in silver to make up the difference, half in salt and nothing else. Take it or leave it. The soldiers nearly rioted. They didn't quite cross that line into open rebellion, because Romans are disciplined even in their anger, but they came close enough that officers started sleeping with their swords drawn, and the camp was one harsh word away from complete chaos. The issue was resolved. Eventually, the way these things always are, someone higher up the chain of command realized what was happening and made it right, and the paymaster in question quietly disappeared from the rolls, transferred to some garrison at the edge of the world where mistakes like that might be forgiven, or at least forgotten. But the message was clear, written in that near riot and remembered in every subsequent payday. Salt is peace. Salt is order. Salt is the thin white line between a soldier who stays at his post and does his duty, and a soldier who starts wondering why he's risking his life for an empire that can't even pay him properly. You've never come close to rioting over your pay, never even considered it, but you understand the impulse now in a way you didn't when you first joined the Legion. Back then, you were young and stupid and full of ideas about honor and glory and serving Rome. Now you're older and maybe slightly less stupid, and you understand that honor doesn't fill your stomach and glory doesn't buy new sandals when yours wear through. What fills your stomach and buys your sandals is salt. Specifically, the 3 librae currently secured in your money belt, pressing against your hip with every step like a heartbeat you can feel from the outside. The weight of it is oddly comforting in a way you've never quite been able to articulate, even to yourself in the privacy of your own thoughts. It's not just the value though, the value is real and significant, it's the solidity of it, the physicality of holding your labor in a form you can touch and smell and measure. Silver coins can be clipped, shaved, debased with cheaper metals until they're worth less than they claim to be. You've seen merchants bite coins to test them, scratch them against stone to see what color metal shows through, weigh them with precision scales because they trust nothing and no one when it comes to money. But salt is salt. You can taste it, and that taste tells you everything you need to know. It works or it doesn't, it's pure or it isn't, and there's no way to fake it that can survive the simplest test. Historians still debate exactly when Rome first started paying soldiers in salt, though you've never met a historian and probably wouldn't trust one if you did, because in your experience, people who spend all their time thinking about the past tend to get the present wrong. Some say it began under the Republic, back when Rome was just one city-state among many, and silver was scarce enough that alternative currencies made sense. Others claim it was always so, that the early legions marched on salt bread and salt meat, and the very word salarium is older than the empire itself, older than the republic that came before it, old enough that its origins are lost in the same mist that obscures the founding of Rome and the truth about Romulus and Remus, and that whole improbable wolf situation. What everyone agrees on, or at least what everyone in the Legion believes, which amounts to the same thing from your perspective, is that for most of Roman history, a soldier's pay wasn't measured in denarii or aurae or any other stamped metal currency. It was measured in something you could hold in your hand, taste on your tongue, feel dissolving against your skin when you sweated through a long march. You turn the pouch over in your hands, feeling the crystals shift inside with that distinctive soft crunch that's become the sound of security in your mind. 3 librae of salt, roughly 2¼ pounds, approximately 1 month's pay for a common soldier in the Roman army at whatever point in history this happens to be. The amount varies, of course, depending on your rank and position and how long you've served. A centurion gets more, a lot more, enough salt to trade for genuine luxuries instead of just necessities. A raw recruit gets less, barely enough to supplement his rations, because the Legion wants you to be hungry enough to stay motivated, but not so hungry that you collapse on the march. But for you, a veteran soldier who's been in service long enough to know better, but not long enough to get promoted out of the ranks, 3 librae is the standard. Enough to live on if you're careful. Enough to die on if you're stupid. Exactly enough to make you show up for the next payday, which is probably the whole point of the system when you think about it. Around you, the other soldiers are dispersing, heading back to their tents or to the market or to wherever soldiers go when they have money in their pockets and time on their hands. Most will save their salt, hoarding it against future need the way your mother hoarded her clay jar. Some will spend it immediately, trading white crystals for wine or dice games, or the kind of company that doesn't ask questions about where you've been or what you've done. You've done both at different times, and neither choice has ever felt particularly right or particularly wrong. Money or salt, or whatever you want to call it, is meant to be spent, but it's also meant to be saved, and the tension between those two purposes is something you've never quite resolved. What you have resolved through years of experience and a few hard lessons about running out of salt at the worst possible time is that you'll keep at least 2 libre back, untouchable, except in genuine emergencies. The remaining pound, about 40% of your total pay, is yours to spend however you see fit. And right now what seems to fit is a proper meal that doesn't taste like camp rations, and maybe a visit to the baths if the town has any that aren't too disgusting. You head toward your tent, weaving through the familiar chaos of camp life: soldiers practicing with wooden swords, cooks arguing over supplies, someone trying to sell a stolen goat while pretending he acquired it through legitimate means. The normal background noise of military life, the sounds you've learned to tune out because if you paid attention to all of it you'd go insane within a week. Your tent is where you left it, which is less obvious than it sounds, because camps are temporary things that rearrange themselves with bewildering speed, and you've walked to where you thought your tent was, only to find a latrine or a supply wagon, or someone else's living quarters. But today, luck is with you. Your tent is right where it should be, your few possessions exactly as you left them, undisturbed except for the layer of dust that settles on everything in this climate. You duck inside, out of the sun, into the relative cool of the shaded interior. The pouch comes off your belt and you place it carefully on the wooden chest that serves as your table, your chair, your altar, and your general purpose surface for anything that needs to be higher than the ground. Undo the drawstring again. Pour a small amount into your palm, maybe a dozen crystals, enough to see them clearly, but not so much that you're risking waste if you drop them. The crystals catch the thin light filtering through the tent fabric, glowing with that quality that makes them look like they're lit from within. It's an illusion. Of course, they're just reflecting the available light in ways that happen to look magical, but it's a convincing illusion, and you find yourself staring at them with more attention than they probably deserve. Each crystal is different when you look close enough. Some are perfect cubes, their faces meeting at precise right angles like they were cut by a geometer who cared deeply about mathematical purity. Others are irregular chunks, all sharp edges and random facets that catch light in chaotic patterns. A few are hollow, tiny crystalline chambers that look like they should contain something, a message, a secret, the truth about why we're here and what we're supposed to do about it. You bring one to your tongue and let it dissolve. The taste is immediate and overwhelming, pure salt, nothing else. The flavor that defines flavor itself in some fundamental way. Your whole mouth waters in response, saliva flooding in to dilute the intensity, your body responding to the chemical signal that something important just arrived. This is what you're paid in. this taste, this chemical reality, this fundamental requirement for human survival that gets delivered to you once a month in a leather pouch because you agreed to stand on walls and march across provinces and occasionally stick sharp things into people who are trying to stick sharp things into you. The thought makes you laugh, a short bark of amusement that sounds loud in the quiet of the tent. The absurdity of it never quite fades, no matter how many times you're paid this way, no matter how normal it becomes. You kill people for salt. Or rather, you agree to possibly kill people in exchange for the regular delivery of seasoning. When you put it that way, it sounds insane. But somehow it isn't. Somehow it's the most reasonable arrangement in the world, because salt isn't just seasoning, and you aren't just killing people. Salt is civilization in crystalline form, and you're protecting that civilization from the chaos that always wants to tear it down. At least, that's what you tell yourself in the moments when the absurdity threatens to overwhelm the sense of it all. You tilt your palm and pour the crystals back into the pouch, watching them tumble over each other in that miniature avalanche that's become one of the most familiar sounds in your life. The soft crystalline rush, like sand through an hourglass, but sharper, more distinct, each crystal clicking against its neighbors as gravity does its inevitable work. The pouch goes back into your money belt, and the money belt goes back around your waist, and you step out of the tent, back into the afternoon heat that hits you like walking into a wall. The sun is directly overhead now, turning shadows into small dark puddles beneath everything that's tall enough to cast them. You have the rest of the day to yourself, a rare luxury in Legion life where most of your time belongs to the Empire and is spent doing whatever the Empire decides you should be doing. You could stay in camp, could join the dice games that are probably already underway in the shade behind the quartermaster's tent, could sleep through the heat and save your energy for the evening. But the weight of the salt against your hip makes you restless in a way that's hard to ignore, like the crystals themselves are pulling you toward the market, toward the town beyond the camp walls, toward the civilian world, where your white gold actually means something. The walk from camp to town takes you along a road that's seen more feet than you can imagine, a road that was old when you were young, that was old when your father was young, that was probably old when Rome was still a collection of mud huts and big ideas. The Via Salaria, they call it in the official records, though everyone just calls it the Salt Road when they bother to call it anything at all. The name is literal in a way that Roman names often aren't. This isn't the Salt Road because it happens to carry salt sometimes, the way other roads happen to carry wine or grain or soldiers. This is the Salt Road because salt is the reason the road exists. The economic justification for all the labor that went into laying stones and building bridges and maintaining the surface through decades of weather and traffic. Salt flows along this road the way water flows in rivers constantly, inexorably, following paths of least resistance from the source to wherever it's needed. You've seen the caravans, massive trains of carts loaded with baskets wrapped in oilcloth to protect the crystals from moisture. each cart guarded like it's carrying the emperor's personal treasury, because in a very real sense it's carrying something more valuable. The emperor's treasury can be replenished. If it's stolen, just raise taxes, debase the currency, confiscate some senator's estate. But if a salt caravan disappears, people starve. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly and inevitably as their supplies run out and food stops being preserved and meals stop tasting like anything worth eating. You've never quite understood how the whole system works, the logistics of it, the economics, the invisible machinery that ensures salt appears where and when it's needed. You've tried asking, a few times, when you met someone who seemed like they might know the answer. A merchant once who just laughed and said if he explained it you'd want a cut of his profits. A quartermaster who gave you a look that suggested the question itself was somehow offensive and told you to get back to your duties. What you do understand, from observation and experience, is that the system is vast beyond comprehension, and yet somehow it works. Every month you get paid. Every month the caravans arrive with more salt to refill the pay wagons. Every month the whole elaborate dance repeats itself without anyone seeming to coordinate it or even think about it very hard. Historians might debate when it started, but they all agree that by the time Rome became an empire, the salt roads were already ancient infrastructure, woven into the landscape so thoroughly that removing them would be like removing the rivers themselves. The Via Salaria wasn't built by any one emperor or even any one generation. It grew, the way roads grow when enough people walk the same path for long enough. First a dirt track, then a gravel path, then paved sections wherever someone had the authority and resources to make it permanent. You're walking on history that predates history, on stones laid by people whose names were forgotten before your grandparents were born, maintained by an endless succession of road gangs who probably never questioned why this particular road gets more attention than others. The answer is salt. Always salt. The white gold that built an empire and keeps it building. The road curves around a hill and the town comes into view, a typical provincial settlement, the kind you've seen 100 times in a dozen different provinces, all of them somehow identical despite their local variations. Walls of varying quality, a market square that's probably the oldest part of the whole settlement, residential areas spreading out like ripples from a stone dropped in water. And cutting through the center of it all, continuing the line of the road you're walking on, is the main street that everyone knows is really the Salt Road, even if they don't call it that. The street where the important merchants set up shop, where the warehouses cluster, where prices are calculated and deals are struck, and the invisible economy that runs on salt does most of its visible business. You've noticed something about towns built along the salt roads. They have a quality, a feeling that's hard to put into words but immediately recognizable once you know what you're looking for. Prosperity, maybe, or at least the potential for prosperity. A sense that trade flows through here regularly enough that people can plan their lives around it, that merchants set up permanent shops instead of temporary stalls, that the buildings are maintained because there's money for maintenance and reasons to believe there will continue to be money for maintenance. Towns that aren't on the salt roads have a different quality, a sense of marginality, of being slightly left behind, of making do with whatever happens to pass through instead of being a destination in itself. Not bad places, necessarily, just less connected to the great flows of goods and value that make the empire function. You pass through the town gates without being stopped or questioned, because the guards recognize a Roman soldier when they see one, and have learned through experience that bothering soldiers about trivial things like gate fees is more trouble than it's worth. The streets are busy with the afternoon trade merchants calling out their wares, customers arguing about prices, children running through the crowd in games that probably make sense to them, dogs investigating every corner for dropped food. The market square is where the real business happens, and you can feel the energy of it from a block away, that particular vibration of commerce in progress, of money changing hands and deals being struck, and the invisible web of trade that connects everyone to everyone else, pulling a little tighter with each transaction. You're looking for bread, specifically, because your rations are adequate but not inspiring, and you have the salt to trade for something better. The baker's stall is easy to find. Just follow your nose toward the smell of fresh baked bread, that aroma that probably predates language as a signal of home and comfort and civilization itself. The baker is a large man, with flour permanently dusted across his arms, and a face that suggests he's seen every negotiation tactic ever invented, and wasn't impressed by any of them. He looks at you, then at the pouch you're pulling from your belt, and his expression shifts in a way that's almost imperceptible, but that you've learned to recognize interest, carefully controlled, but definitely there. Bread, you say, because elaborate negotiations aren't your strength, and you see no point in pretending otherwise. I have bread, the baker says, in a tone that suggests this is the most obvious statement ever made by anyone in the history of human speech. Question is what you're paying with. You loosen the drawstring and let him see the white crystals inside. His eyes light up in a way that would be comical if it wasn't so clearly genuine. This is a man who loves salt the way other men love gold or glory or conquest, who understands exactly what it means for his business and his bread and his ability to keep both of those things thriving. How much? He asks, and now there's respect in his voice that wasn't there before. The respect one businessman shows another when negotiations are about to get interesting. You consider the question, weighing what you're willing to spend against what you're hoping to get. Bread is important, but so is having salt left over for everything else you'll need before the next payday. This is the eternal calculation of life on the frontier, how much to spend now versus how much to save for later, knowing that both choices carry risks you can't fully predict. 2 handfuls for a week's worth, you say, which is probably too much, but you want good bread, not the hard stuff that requires soaking before you can chew it. The baker considers this with the seriousness it deserves, then nods. "Done," he says, and begins wrapping loaves in cloth with the efficiency of someone who's done this exact transaction 1,000 times before. You measure out the salt 2 actual handfuls, generous portions that probably exceed what you said, but the baker notices and doesn't complain, which suggests you've made a fair deal, and possibly even a favourable one. The crystals go into his own container, a large clay jar that's probably seen decades of use and will see decades more, and the bread goes into the bag you brought for exactly this purpose. The transaction is complete. Salt became bread through the medium of mutual need and a shared understanding of value. This is how economies work at their most fundamental level, not through complex theories or government mandates, but through simple exchanges between people who have what others want and want what others have. You walk away from the baker's stall with your bag heavier and your pouch lighter, and both of these facts feel right in a way that's hard to articulate. The weight of the bread is immediate and satisfying. The reduced weight of the salt is concerning but necessary. This is life trading one good thing for another good thing and hoping you calculated correctly about which you needed more. Around you, the market continues its endless business, and if you pay attention, really pay attention, and the way you're paying attention now, for reasons you can't quite explain, you can see the salt roads in miniature right here in this square. Every store has salt, either to sell or to use in their goods. Every merchant accepts salt as payment, often preferring it to coin. Every transaction is part of the larger flow of salt through the economy, connecting this small provincial town to Ostia and Rome and the furthest reaches of the empire in an invisible network that makes everything possible. You've become part of that network today, trading your labor for salt and your salt for bread, and the bread will become energy, and the energy will become more labor, and the cycle will continue until you die or retire or the empire collapses, whichever comes first. The thought should probably be depressing, but somehow it isn't. There's comfort in being part of something larger than yourself, in knowing that your small transactions are nodes in a vast web that's been functioning for generations and will probably function for generations more. The salt roads will outlast you, and that's fine. That's maybe even the point. 字数2104. Back in your tent as evening approaches, you find yourself holding a single salt crystal up to the fading light, examining it with more attention than it probably warrants. It's small, maybe the size of a grain of rice, maybe smaller but perfectly formed, a tiny cube with faces so flat and edges so sharp that it looks like something deliberately crafted rather than something that just happened through natural processes. The crystal catches the light and splits it into colors you don't have names for, subtle variations of white and clear that shift as you rotate your hand. There's beauty here, if you're in the mood to notice it, a geometric perfection that seems impossible for something that formed in a shallow pond under ordinary sun, without anyone planning or intending it. You've never thought much about where salt comes from, beyond the obvious fact that it comes from the sea and someone has to harvest it. But holding this single crystal and really looking at it, you find yourself wondering about the process that created something so precisely shaped from the chaos of dissolved minerals and evaporating water. Somewhere, probably Ostia, which is where most of Rome's salt comes from, but possibly one of the other coastal salt works scattered along the empire's shorelines, there's a system of shallow ponds. Seawater flows into these ponds at high tide, then gets trapped there when the tide goes out. The sun does the rest, slowly evaporating the water day after day, until all that's left is a thick brine that's more salt than water, and then a crust of crystals that forms on the bottom like snow accumulating on a winter field. Someone wades into those ponds, probably a woman, because the work of harvesting salt seems to fall mostly to women for reasons no one has ever explained to you, and scrapes the crystals into baskets. It's hard work, you imagine, the kind that leaves your hands white and cracked and permanently changed by the salt you handle every single day. You've met one of these workers once, years ago, when you were stationed near Ostia and had enough free time to wander the salt marshes out of curiosity. An old woman with hands that looked like they'd been carved from salt themselves, every crease outlined in white, the skin so dry it seemed like it might crack and fall away if she moved too quickly. She'd looked at you, a young soldier, gawking at the salt ponds like they were some kind of wonder, and laughed in a way that wasn't quite mean but wasn't exactly friendly either. "You get paid in this," she'd said. "Not a question, just a statement of fact. I make what you get paid with. Think about which of us has the harder job." You'd had no answer for that then, and you have no answer for it now, except that she was probably right and you were too young and stupid to understand what she was really saying. She wasn't just harvesting salt. She was creating value from nothing, turning free seawater and free sunshine into the currency that kept an empire functioning. You were just the end point of that process, the consumer who took the value she created and traded it for bread and sandals and survival. The crystal in your hand came from hands like hers, shaped by processes you don't understand, traveling hundreds of miles through systems you can barely imagine to end up here in your tent at the edge of the empire. It's simultaneously the most mundane thing in the world, just salt, something you use every day without thinking, and the most extraordinary. You place the crystal on your tongue and let it dissolve slowly this time, paying attention to the process instead of just experiencing it. First, there's the sharp taste, immediate and overwhelming, that makes your whole mouth water. Then the dissolving begins, the crystal breaking down into solution, releasing its flavor and its chemistry into your saliva. Within seconds, it's gone transformed from solid to liquid, from visible to invisible, from something you could hold to something you can only taste. This is what happens to all salt eventually. It dissolves into something else, into food, into flesh, into the sweat that carries it away from your body on hot marches. Salt is temporary in any given form, but permanent in total, the same salt, cycling through the same systems over and over, ocean to pond, to crystal to body, to ocean, again, in an endless loop that predates humanity and will continue long after humanity is gone. Historians still argue about whether ancient peoples understood this cycle, whether they knew that the salt they harvested from coastal ponds was the same salt that had been in the ocean since the world began, is less than has known. 2 is greater than. The answer probably depends on which ancient peoples you're talking about. Some cultures developed sophisticated theories about the nature of salt and its place in the cosmos. Others just harvested it and used it and didn't worry too much about the philosophy of it all. Romans, in your experience, tend toward the practical end of that spectrum. Salt is useful, salt has value, therefore we harvest it and trade it and use it to pay our soldiers. The fact that it comes from the sea and returns to the sea is interesting but not particularly relevant to the business of running an empire. But lying here in your tent with the taste of salt still sharp on your tongue, you find yourself thinking about that cycle anyway. About the woman in the salt ponds with her ruined hands. About the ships that carried this salt across the Mediterranean. About the warehouses in Rome where it was stored and guarded and eventually distributed to pay wagons heading to the provinces. About the paymaster who weighed it and handed it to you with his expression of practiced boredom. About all the other soldiers across the empire receiving their own pouches at this same moment, all of them holding the same white crystals and thinking their own thoughts about what it means to be paid in something so common and so valuable at the same time. It's too much to hold in your head all at once. This vast interconnected system of production and distribution and consumption that you're only one small part of. So you stop trying. You secure the pouch back in your money belt, eat some of the bread you bought earlier, which is excellent, worth every crystal you paid for it, and try to settle into the evening routine that will eventually lead to sleep. But the questions linger at the edge of your thoughts, refusing to be completely dismissed. How many hands touched this salt before it reached you? How many more will touch it after you trade it away? How many cycles has it completed from ocean to land and back again? How many more will it complete before the sun burns out or the seas dry up or whatever eventually happens to end the world? You've heard philosophers in the better taverns talk about the eternal nature of matter, how nothing is ever created or destroyed, only transformed from one state to another. At the time, it seemed like the kind of abstract nonsense that educated people say to make themselves feel important. But holding salt and tasting salt and understanding that this exact salt has been in the world forever and will be in the world forever, just in different forms, that makes the philosophy feel real in a way that words never could. The evening darkens into night, the sounds of the camp shifting from the activity of day to the quieter rhythms of watch changes and late conversations and soldiers settling down to sleep. You're part of that rhythm too, your own small contribution to the larger pattern of Legion life. Tomorrow you'll march or train or stand guard or do whatever the army decides you should do, and you'll do it with a pouch of salt at your hip, a constant reminder that your labor has value and that value can be transformed into other things you need to survive. It's a simple system when you break it down to basics. Work becomes salt, becomes food, becomes energy, becomes more work. A cycle as eternal as the salt cycle itself, and just as impossible to escape from. You close your eyes and try to sleep, but your mind keeps returning to that single crystal dissolving on your tongue, breaking down into nothing visible but remaining completely present in a different form. It's a metaphor for something, probably, but you're too tired to work out exactly what. Sal endures. Salt transforms. Salt connects everything to everything else in loops that have no beginning and no end. And somehow, impossibly, you get paid in it. The thought makes you smile in the darkness, a small private expression of amusement at the absurdity and rightness of it all. You're a soldier in the Roman army, paid in ancient seawater, carrying crystallized ocean at your hip like it's the most normal thing in the world. Which, from a certain perspective, it absolutely is. Sleep comes eventually, as it always does, carrying you away from these thoughts into dreams that probably feature salt in ways you won't remember when you wake. The pouch remains at your side, still heavy with its cargo of white gold, waiting for tomorrow and whatever transformations it will undergo in the endless cycle that neither you nor anyone else can break or escape from. And somewhere far away, in salt ponds along the coast, a worker is wading into brine to harvest more crystals under the same moon that's shining down on your tent, her hands turning white as she creates the value that will eventually become someone else's pay, someone else's bread, someone else's survival. The cycle continues, with or without your awareness, with or without your understanding, simply because it must and always has and probably always will. 字数2044. 3 days later, you find yourself on patrol duty that takes you along a coastal route you've never traveled before, and by sheer coincidence, or the kind of fate that makes you wonder if the gods actually pay attention to individual human lives, you pass by a working salt operation. It's smaller than the massive works at Ostia, just a dozen shallow ponds step down a hillside toward the sea, each one filled with water in varying stages of evaporation. The ponds closest to the ocean are almost clear, barely saltier than the sea they came from. The ones further up the slope are cloudy with dissolved minerals, thick as milk. And the highest ponds, the ones that have been evaporating the longest, are crusted white with salt, the crystals visible even from the road. A woman is working the highest pond, and even from a distance you can see the white stains on her hands and forearms, the telltale signs of someone who spends their days touching salt with bare skin. She's using a wooden rake to scrape the crystals into piles, working with the steady rhythm of someone who's done this exact task thousands of times and will do it thousands more. Your patrol route takes you close enough that stopping to watch doesn't require any deviation from duty, so you stop. The rest of your contubernium, the 8-man unit that's been your family for the past 3 years, keeps moving, used to your occasional curiosities about things that don't directly involve fighting or drinking or gambling. The woman notices you watching and straightens up, using the rake handle to support herself in a way that suggests her back hurts from the constant bending. She's maybe 40, maybe 60. It's hard to tell with people who work outdoors their entire lives, the sun and wind aging them in ways that have nothing to do with years. "Help you with something, soldier?" she asks. Not unfriendly, but not particularly warm either. The tone of someone who's talking to a stranger and isn't sure yet whether that stranger is going to be a problem. "Just watching," you say, which is the truth, but probably sounds strange anyway. Never seen salt harvested before? Her expression shifts into something that might be amusement, or might be contempt, or might be some combination of the two. "You're paid in it though," she says, the same words the old woman in Ostia said to you years ago, as if this is a standard observation among salt workers when they talk to soldiers. "I am," you admit, feeling vaguely embarrassed for reasons you can't quite articulate. 3 libri a month. "I harvest 3 libri before breakfast," she says, and now there's definitely amusement in her voice, though not the cruel kind. "Been doing this since I was old enough to hold a rake. My mother did it before me, and her mother before that, and probably her mother too, though nobody alive remembers that far back." She holds up her hands, showing you the white stains that have penetrated so deep into the skin they'll probably never wash out completely. "Salt gets into everything," she explains. "Your skin, your lungs, your blood probably. After a while, you don't notice it anymore. But it's always there, always part of you, whether you want it to be or not." You look at your own hands, which are calloused from sword work and stained with the general dirt of military life, but otherwise unmarked. The salt you carry touches you only through leather, only temporarily, only in ways you can wash off if you have enough water and time. She lives in salt, breathes it, has absorbed it into her very being in ways that make your relationship with it seem almost superficial. "How much does it hurt?" you ask, because you've heard that salt on skin can burn if there's enough of it, that prolonged exposure causes problems. You're glad you've never had to experience firsthand. "How much does anything hurt?" she responds, which is an answer but not the one you were asking for. You get used to it. Everything hurts at first: the salt, the sun, the standing in water all day. But your body learns, adjusts, figures out how to survive it. Now I barely notice, unless it's a particularly bad day. She goes back to raking, pulling the salt crystals into neat piles that catch the morning light and throw it back in brilliant white flashes. You watch in silence, and she doesn't seem to mind the audience, working with the same steady rhythm whether you're there or not. After a few minutes, she speaks again without looking up from her work. "You know what's strange?" she says. "I make the stuff you get paid with, but I could never afford to save enough to pay myself a month's salary. All this salt," she gestures at the pond stretching up the hillside, "belongs to someone else. Some merchant in Rome or Ostia who owns the land and the ponds and the right to harvest what grows in them. I just do the work. You've never thought about salt having owners before, about someone claiming property rights over crystals that form naturally through sun and evaporation. But of course someone owns it, someone always owns everything. That's how the empire works, how maybe everything works if you trace the chains of ownership far enough back. What do they pay you, you ask, genuinely curious now about the economics of salt production from the worker's perspective rather than the recipient's. Enough to eat, she says, which is an answer that tells you both everything and nothing. A place to live, which is really just a hut on the property, so I'm always here when they need salt harvested. Sometimes extra if the harvest is good and the owner is feeling generous, though that doesn't happen as often as you might think. She straightens up again, looking at you with an expression you can't quite read. You ever wonder where your pay really comes from? She asks. Not just which pond or which warehouse, but who actually made it. Whose hands touched it before yours? Whose sweat mixed with the brine? You have wondered exactly that. Especially recently, especially since you started paying closer attention to the salt in your pouch instead of just treating it as a given feature of military life. But admitting this feels like admitting something deeper, something about the nature of value and labor and who benefits from whose work. Sometimes you say carefully, "Well, now you know," she says, gesturing at herself with the rake. People like me. Women mostly, because apparently men have better things to do than stand in salt ponds all day. We make what you get paid with, and what merchants trade with, and what keeps the empire running, whether the empire knows it or cares. She's not bitter, exactly, or if she is, it's the kind of bitterness that's been worn smooth by years of repetition until it's just another fact about the world, no more worth complaining about than the weather or the tides. This is her life, the same way fighting and marching and occasionally dying is your life, and neither of you chose it so much as ended up in it through circumstances that started before you were born. I'm sorry, you say, though you're not entirely sure what you're apologizing for. She laughs at that, a short bark of genuine amusement that surprises both of you. Don't be sorry for me, soldier. I'm alive. I have work. I haven't starved yet, and probably won't tomorrow either. That's more than a lot of people can say. You want to feel sorry for someone, feel sorry for the people who don't have work or salt or any way to get either. She returns to her raking, and you take that as dismissal, nodding respectfully, even though she's not looking at you anymore. You jog to catch up with your contubernium, who waited for you just out of earshot, pretending they weren't listening to every word of a conversation they probably didn't find nearly as interesting as you did. But as you march, you keep thinking about her hands, about the white stains that mark her as surely as your scars mark you, about the fact that she spends her life creating the currency you spend your life earning. The system suddenly seems less elegant and more troubling, though you can't quite articulate why. Historians sometimes write about the Roman economy as if it's a perfect machine, a marvel of organization and efficiency that allows the empire to function at scales that would have been impossible for earlier civilizations. And maybe it is a marvel, in its way, the fact that salt harvested in some coastal pond can end up paying a soldier hundreds of miles inland is genuinely impressive as a logistical achievement. But the machine runs on people like that woman, people whose names will never appear in any history, whose labor makes everything else possible but who benefit least from the system they sustain. You've always known this on some abstract level. Empires run on the work of ordinary people. That's obvious to anyone who thinks about it for more than a minute, but seeing it personified in salt-stained hands makes it real in a different way. You reach down and touch the pouch at your hip, feeling the familiar weight through the leather and cloth. The salt inside came from hands like hers, hands that have touched more salt in a single day than you'll touch in your entire military career. Hands that created value for you to spend, transforming free seawater and free sunlight into the currency that feeds you and clothes you and keeps you alive. It should make you feel guilty, maybe, or at least uncomfortable. But what it actually makes you feel is connected to her, to the salt, to the whole vast system of production and distribution and consumption that ties everyone in the empire together, whether they know it or not. You're using what she made, and someone else will use what you buy with it, and the cycle continues in ways that benefit some people more than others, but that includes everyone, regardless. That night, when you pour out a pinch of salt to flavor your rations, you find yourself thinking about the woman in the salt pond, wondering if any of these specific crystals came from her rake, from her labor, from the ponds you watched her working that morning. Probably not. The logistics of salt distribution don't work that directly, and your pay likely comes from larger operations at Ostia or other major production sites. But maybe some of these crystals were scraped from shallow ponds by hands that will never be clean again, by people who spend their lives creating wealth for others to enjoy. Maybe the value you hold in your hand has her fingerprints on it, invisible but real, connecting you to her labor in ways that no amount of commerce can fully erase. The salt dissolves on your tongue the same way it always does, sharp, immediate, essential. But now there's an awareness attached to the taste, a knowledge of where it came from and who made it that adds layers of meaning that weren't there before. Salt connects everything to everything else. You've thought this before, but now you understand it includes the connections between people, between labor and value, between those who create wealth and those who spend it. The whole empire runs on these connections, these invisible threads that tie workers to soldiers, to merchants, to customers in loops that have no clear beginning and no obvious end. You fall asleep thinking about salt-stained hands working in the sun, creating the white gold that makes your life possible, and in your dreams those hands become your own hands, become everyone's hands, all of us connected through salt, whether we acknowledge it or ignore it, or simply take it for granted as one more background feature of a world we didn't build but have to live in anyway. 字数2096. 2 months later, your legion receives orders to march to Rome itself, not for combat, because there's no combat in the heart of the empire, but for some political ceremony that requires military presence to look impressive and remind everyone that power ultimately comes from people with swords. You don't care about the politics, but you care very much about the chance to finally see the capital, to walk streets you've heard about for years but never expected to experience yourself. The march takes 3 weeks, following roads that get progressively better the closer you get to Rome, like the empire is showing off its wealth and organization through the quality of its infrastructure. By the time you're within a day's walk of the city, the road is so smooth and well maintained that marching feels almost easy, your feet hitting consistent stone instead of the mud and gravel you've become accustomed to in the provinces. Rome announces itself from miles away, first as a smudge of smoke on the horizon, then as a cluster of buildings too numerous to count, finally as a vast, sprawling entity that seems less like a city and more like a natural feature of the landscape, as inevitable as mountains or rivers. You've seen cities before, plenty of them, but nothing prepared you for the sheer scale of Rome, the way it spreads across hills and valleys like it owns the earth itself. Your cohort is quartered in temporary barracks near the Forum, close enough to the center of everything that you can hear the city's constant noise, even through the walls, merchants hawking goods, customers arguing prices, construction crews working on buildings that look like they've been under construction since the world began, politicians making speeches to crowds who probably aren't listening. But what you're interested in, what you've been curious about ever since you started thinking seriously about where your salt comes from, are the warehouses. The ones near the Forum are massive fortified structures that look more like military installations than commercial buildings. Thick walls, narrow windows reinforced with iron bars, doors that would require a battering ram to breach. You know from conversations with other soldiers that these warehouses store salt, among other valuable commodities, and that they're guarded night and day by soldiers whose job is exactly what you do, but in a much more boring location. No frontier excitement, no possibility of combat glory, just standing at a door making sure nobody steals the Empire's salt supply. On your second day in Rome, you have the afternoon free and decide to investigate, walking to the warehouse district with no particular plan beyond satisfying your curiosity. The warehouses are easy to find. Just follow the streets that seem most commercial. Watch for the buildings that look most fortified. Pay attention to where the merchants are congregating and complaining about prices. The guard at the nearest warehouse is younger than you, which means he's either very new or very unlucky in his posting assignments. He straightens up when he sees you approaching, and moving toward his gladius in the reflexive gesture of someone who's been told that strangers approaching warehouses are probably thieves and should be treated with appropriate suspicion. "Easy," you say, holding up your hands to show you're not a threat. "Just curious. Never seen a salt warehouse before." His posture relaxes slightly, though his hand doesn't move far from his weapon. "Not much to see from out here," he says. "Just a door and walls and me standing between them." What's it like inside? You ask, and his expression suggests this is the first time anyone has asked him this question, possibly the first time anyone has asked him any question beyond, when does your shift end? Dark, he says after a moment's consideration. Cool, even when it's hot outside. The salt is packed in baskets, wrapped in oilcloth, stacked to the ceiling in rows that go back farther than you can see even with torches. Thousands of baskets, maybe tens of thousands, more salt than you've probably seen in your entire life, all in one place. How much is it worth, you ask, though you're not sure the question makes sense when applied to such large quantities. More than I'll make in a lifetime, he says, which is probably true but not particularly informative. More than most people can imagine. Salt is cheap when you buy a pinch at a time, but when you have this much of it all together, it's worth. I don't even know what to compare it to. A fortune in silver, maybe, or what a province pays in taxes for a year. You try to imagine thousands of baskets of salt, each one containing many times your monthly pay, all stored in the darkness behind this wall and this door, and this young guard who looks like he's wondering if he should be having this conversation with a stranger. Who owns it all? You ask, because ownership seems like an important question even though you're not sure why you're asking it. Different merchants, mostly, he says. Some belongs to the state directly, for military pay and government use. The rest is private, owned by trading companies who buy salt at the source and store it here until prices are right for selling. We don't care who owns which basket, our job is just to make sure nobody takes any basket that isn't theirs to take. He seems to realize he's been talking more than regulations probably allow, because his expression shifts back to professional neutrality and his hand tightens again on his weapon. I should get back to watching the door, he says, which is a polite way of saying this conversation is over. You thank him and move away. But the image stays with you, thousands of baskets of salt in the darkness, guarded like treasure, because that's exactly what it is, all that accumulated white gold just sitting there waiting to be distributed to soldiers like you across the empire. Historians love to talk about Rome's grain supply, about how the empire developed sophisticated systems for shipping wheat from Egypt and Africa to feed the million people crammed into the capital. But they talk less about the salt supply, maybe because it seems less essential, or maybe because it's so fundamental that it doesn't seem worth mentioning, like talking about air or water, as if those are special systems rather than basic requirements for existence. But salt is more fundamental than grain, in a way. You can survive without grain if you have other food sources, but you can't survive without salt no matter what you eat. And Rome uses salt on a scale that would be impossible without these warehouses, without the fortifications and guards, and the whole elaborate system for protecting what amounts to crystallized seawater that anyone could theoretically make if they had access to a coastline and enough time. The fact that it needs to be protected this seriously tells you something about human nature and economics and scarcity that you don't fully understand but can feel the shape of. Salt is common and essential and valuable all at the same time, and those three qualities together create a situation where theft is both easy and tempting, which means security becomes necessary, which means warehouses become fortresses and merchants hire private armies, and the whole thing spirals into the kind of complexity that makes empire possible and also slightly insane. You wander the warehouse district for another hour, counting the fortified buildings, watching merchants come and go with their ledgers and contracts, observing the constant flow of goods and money and salt that moves through this neighborhood like blood through a body. This is the heart of the salt economy, the place where production meets distribution, where barrels of crystals become ledger entries, become wealth that can be traded and invested and leveraged into more wealth. It's all very abstract when you think about it. These merchants aren't interested in salt for its own sake, aren't planning to personally use thousands of baskets of crystals for preserving food or seasoning meals. They're interested in salt as a commodity, as a thing that has value because other people need it and will pay for it, and the actual physical salt is almost incidental to the financial instruments and trading relationships that constitute the real business being done here. But to you, salt remains stubbornly physical. Those white crystals in your pouch aren't abstract value. They're actual things you can taste and smell and trade for bread. The disconnect between your relationship with salt and the merchant's relationship with it makes you feel like you're living in a different economy, even though you're both part of the same system. That night, back in your temporary barracks, you pour out your remaining salt and count it with more attention than usual, trying to calculate how much of the warehouse's total supply you're holding. The math is impossible. You don't know how much each basket contains, don't know how many baskets are in the warehouse, don't know how many warehouses there are in Rome or across the empire. But it's clearly a tiny fraction, a negligible amount that wouldn't be missed if you and your entire legion suddenly disappeared. The empire would keep functioning. The warehouses would keep filling and emptying. The salt would keep flowing from ponds to storage to distribution to consumption without any awareness that you ever existed. The thought should probably be depressing. You're insignificant in a system too large to care about individual soldiers, but instead it's oddly comforting. The system that pays you is solid, established, bigger than any one person or even any one generation. It was here before you joined the Legion and will be here long after you die or retire, grinding along with the inevitability of rivers flowing downhill. Your small portion of salt came from that system and will return to it when you spend it, and the cycle will continue regardless of who you are or what you do. There's security in that, a kind of permanence that individual lives can never achieve, but that systems somehow can. You sleep well that night, surrounded by the sounds of Rome at work and rest and everything in between, your pouch of salt secured under your bedroll where no one can take it without waking you first. In your dreams, you walk through endless warehouses, filled with white crystals that glow like stars in the darkness, and somewhere far away, workers are filling more baskets to replace what gets distributed, and the cycle continues forever, whether you're part of it or not. The market in Rome is overwhelming in a way that provincial markets can never be. Too many people, too much noise, too many goods from too many places, all competing for attention and money in a chaos that somehow resolves itself into functioning commerce. You've been warned about pickpockets and scam artists, about merchants who sell fake goods at real prices, about all the ways a soldier with money can become a soldier without money faster than seems physically possible. But you're careful and suspicious, and you keep one hand on your money belt at all times, which makes you look paranoid, but also makes you a less attractive target than the tourists and provincials who gawk at everything with their purses dangling loose. You navigate the press of bodies toward the food stalls, because you need to eat, and the camp rations are even worse in Rome than they are in the provinces, which you wouldn't have believed possible if you hadn't experienced it yourself. The preserved fish stall catches your attention because it's demonstrating exactly the process you've been thinking about for weeks now. Salt transforming food from temporary to permanent, from perishable to preserved, from something that will rot in a day to something that will last for months. The merchant has whole fish laid out on display, each one packed in a thick layer of salt that covers it completely except for the head and tail, making them look like they've been carved from white crystal. Fresh from the coast, the merchant announces to no one in particular and everyone within earshot. Packed in salt this morning, will keep until next summer if you store them right. Best fish in Rome, preserved the traditional way, none of that new pickling nonsense that makes everything taste like vinegar. You edge closer to examine the fish, fascinated by the transformation that salt has worked on them. They look dead, which they are, but also somehow not dead, like they're suspended in a state between life and death, waiting for the salt to be washed away so they can resume whatever they were doing before being caught. It's an illusion, obviously, but a compelling one. You buying or just looking? The merchant asks, his tone somewhere between annoyed and hopeful, like he can't decide whether you're a customer or a waste of his time. How long does it actually keep? You ask, because the merchant's claim seems impossible even though you know salt preservation works. Months, he says confidently. 6, 8, sometimes longer if you're careful about moisture. Salt pulls the water out of the flesh, and without water, nothing can rot. It's the oldest preservation method in the world, older than Rome, older than civilization probably. People have been doing this since they first realized salt does more than make food taste good. He's right, you realize, though you've never thought about it this explicitly before. Salt preservation predates history, must have been discovered very early in human development, maybe by accident, a fish left in a salt pond, someone tasting it later and realizing it was still edible, the knowledge spreading from there into a technology that would feed empires. Historians still debate exactly when and where salt preservation was invented, though invented probably isn't the right word for something that might have been discovered independently by multiple cultures in multiple places. What they agree on is that by the time writing exists to record these things, salt preservation is already ancient knowledge, passed down so many generations that no one remembers a time before it. How much salt does it take to preserve one fish, you ask, trying to connect the fish on display to the pouches of salt in the warehouses you saw yesterday, to your own pay sitting in your money belt. The merchant gives you a look that suggests this is an odd question to ask, but one he's willing to answer if it leads to a sale. Depends on the size of the fish, he says. These here, he gestures at the medium-sized fish on display, each maybe as long as your forearm, maybe half a libra of salt each to pack them properly. Bigger fish need more, smaller fish need less, but it's always more salt than you'd think. People see the price and complain, but they're not just paying for the fish, they're paying for the salt that keeps it edible and the skill that knows exactly how to apply it. Half a libra per fish means your monthly pay could preserve 6 fish this size, which seems like it should mean something, but you're not sure what. The fish and the salt are both commodities, both valuable, both essential to feeding Rome and feeding the empire, but they exist in different categories of value that don't translate easily into each other. I'll take one, you decide, because you have salt to spend and the camp food really is terrible and you're tired of eating the same bland porridge every single day. The merchant's expression shifts immediately into something more genuinely friendly, the warmth that comes from making a sale rather than just answering questions. Good choice, he says, wrapping one of the salt-packed fish in an additional layer of cloth to make it easier to carry. That'll be 2 handfuls of salt or the equivalent in coin, your choice. You pour out salt into his measuring bowl, watching the white crystals accumulate until he signals that it's enough. 2 handfuls is actually more than half a libra, you're pretty sure, but you don't argue because you've never mastered the art of bargaining and the fish is probably worth it. The wrapped fish goes into your pack, adding weight but also adding the promise of better meals for the next week or so. Your salt pouch is noticeably lighter now, first the bread a few weeks ago, now this fish, and you're starting to understand why soldiers always seem to run out of pay before the end of the month. The salt goes fast when you're actually using it, instead of just hoarding it in your money belt. But the transaction has given you something to think about beyond the immediate exchange of salt for fish. The merchant said salt pulls water out of flesh, and without water nothing can rot. It's a simple principle, but one with profound implications. Salt doesn't preserve food by adding something to it, but by removing something from it, by creating conditions where the bacteria and fungi that cause decay can't survive. You've seen decay, of course, seen meat rot in the sun, seen grain grow mouldy, seen what happens to bodies when they're left in the heat too long. Decay is the natural state of things, the baseline that everything returns to if you don't actively prevent it. Salt prevents it through subtraction rather than addition, through creating a hostile environment rather than a protective one. It's backwards from how you usually think about preservation, which involves adding things oil to metal to prevent rust, wax to wood to prevent rot, whatever coating or treatment keeps the elements at bay. But salt works by taking away, by making food so dry and inhospitable that nothing can live in it long enough to cause decay. And this same principle that preserves fish preserves empires, in a way that's suddenly very clear to you standing in this market with a salt-packed fish in your bag and a lighter pouch at your belt. Rome can project power across vast distances because salt allows food to be preserved long enough to ship it from Egypt or Africa or Gaul to wherever the legions need it. Armies can march across deserts and mountains because their supply trains carry salted meat that won't rot before it's eaten. Without salt, Rome would be constrained by the same logistical limits that constrained every empire before it. You can only march as far as your food supply allows, can only conquer territory that's close enough to feed your armies with fresh provisions. With salt, those limits expand dramatically, allowing for the kind of sustained campaigns that create empires instead of just kingdoms. The merchant is already moving on to the next customer, his brief interest in you forgotten as soon as the transaction completed. But you linger for a moment, looking at the remaining fish on display, each one a small testament to salt's power to transform and preserve and make possible things that wouldn't otherwise be possible. Salt is more than currency, you realize. It's infrastructure. It's the invisible technology that makes everything else work, the foundation on which the empire is built whether anyone acknowledges it or not. And you carry a piece of that infrastructure at your hip, spending it on fish and bread and survival, participating in systems you barely understand, but that couldn't function without millions of people like you making similar small exchanges every single day. You leave the market with your fish and your thoughts, both of them heavier than when you arrived, both of them preserved in their own ways, one in salt, the other in the meat of your brain where they'll last longer than any fish ever could. 字数2015. On your last day in Rome before the legion marches back to the provinces, you find yourself in a part of the city you haven't visited before, a quieter neighborhood away from the market chaos, where administrative buildings cluster like they're trying to hide from the rest of Rome's noise and energy. You're here by accident, having taken a wrong turn while trying to find a specific bathhouse someone recommended, but the accident turns out to be fortunate in ways you couldn't have predicted. One of the buildings has a small sign in Latin identifying it as a records office, the kind of place where bureaucrats keep track of things that need tracking, where transactions get recorded and stored for posterity, or at least until the papyrus deteriorates beyond reading. The door is open, and through it you can see shelves packed with scrolls and tablets, more written records than you've ever seen in one place. A clerk is sitting at a desk near the door, copying something from one tablet to another with the mechanical precision of someone who's done this task so many times that their hand knows the movements without any input from their brain. He looks up when you enter, his expression shifting from boredom to mild interest when he sees your military uniform. "Help you?" he asks, not unfriendly but making it clear that he's busy and you should state your business quickly if you want his attention. just curious, you say, which is becoming your standard explanation for wandering into places you probably shouldn't be. What kind of records do you keep here? His expression suggests this is an unusual question, but one he's willing to answer. All kinds, he says, gesturing at the shelves behind him. Tax records, property transfers, contracts, census data. Anything that needs to be official and permanent, we make a copy and store it here. Do you keep military pay records? You ask, the question forming before you fully know why you're asking it. Some, he says, his interest increasing slightly, like you've accidentally stumbled into his area of expertise, or at least the area he finds least boring. We keep records of payments to legions, how much salt was distributed, which units received it, dates and amounts, and the officer who signed off on the distribution. Not individual soldier records, those are kept by the legions themselves, but the big picture stuff that tells Rome how much salt it's paying out to its armies. He stands and walks to one of the shelves, running his finger along the tablets until he finds what he's looking for. This one here, he says, pulling out a large wax tablet bound in wood, records last year's salt payments to the 10th Legion. See, he shows you the tablet, which is covered in neat columns of numbers and notations that you can barely read, even though you technically know Latin. The numbers are staggering when you manage to pass them. Thousands of librae of salt per month, multiplied by 12 months, distributed across all the cohorts and centuries that make up a full legion. Your 3 librae per month is such a small fraction of the total that it barely registers, a rounding error in the vast calculations that keep the military functioning. How long do you keep these records? You ask, suddenly curious about the permanence of your own small place in this vast machine. Forever, theoretically, the clerk says, returning the tablet to its shelf. In practice, probably a few decades before they get moved to long-term storage in archives that nobody looks at anymore. But the point is to have them if anyone ever needs to verify what was paid when and to whom. Prevents fraud, settles disputes, provides proof if someone claims they didn't receive their pay or received less than they should have. You've never thought about your pay being recorded anywhere beyond the paymaster's immediate ledger, never considered that your monthly 3 librae might be part of a permanent record that will outlast your military service and possibly your entire life. It's simultaneously significant your labor and pay are important enough to record permanently, and insignificant you're just one line item in ledgers that contain thousands of similar entries. Can you show me what a salt payment looks like? You ask, and the clerk hesitates, clearly weighing whether this is allowed, whether he's supposed to be showing military records to random soldiers who wander in off the street. But curiosity or boredom, or maybe just the lack of specific regulations against it wins out, and he pulls down another tablet, this one more recent. This is from 2 months ago, he says, opening it to show you a page of dense Latin text. It records the salt payment to your legion. Which legion are you with? You tell him, and he flips through the tablet until he finds the relevant entry, pointing to a line of text that includes your unit's designation and the total amount of salt distributed. There, he says. That's your cohort's payment for, he checks the date, April. 240 libre total, distributed to 80 soldiers, comes out to 3 libre per soldier. You stare at the line of text, at the dry bureaucratic notation that represents your pay and the pay of every other man in your unit. Somewhere in that total is your portion, impossible to distinguish from anyone else's, indistinguishable, except for the fact that you know you received it and spent some of it on bread and fish, and you still have some of it in your money belt right now. Historians sometimes argue about whether the Romans were exceptionally good at record keeping or just average for their time, but better at preserving those records than other civilizations. The argument seems academic from where you're standing, looking at tablets that record transactions you participated in, that prove you exist in a way that military service alone might not prove to future generations who have no other evidence of your life. Why does Rome keep such detailed records, you ask, and the clerk looks at you like you've asked why water flows downhill. Isn't it obvious? Because memory fails, he says simply. People forget, people lie, people die and take their knowledge with them. Records persist. They're not perfect. Tablets crack, papyrus deteriorates, scribes make mistakes, but they're better than nothing, better than relying on human memory alone. He returns the tablet to its shelf, handling it with the care of someone who understands that what he's holding is more than just wax and wood. It's memory made physical. Knowledge preserved beyond the human lifespan, proof that things happened the way the records say they happened. Your pay is recorded here, he continues, warming to his subject in the way people do when they're talking about something they actually care about, instead of just doing by rote. 50 years from now, 100 years from now, someone could come to this office and look up exactly how much salt your legion was paid in any given month. They won't know your name. Individual soldiers don't make it into these records, but they'll know your unit existed and received payment and was part of the system. It's a strange kind of immortality, you think. Not the personal kind where future generations remember your name and deeds, but the collective kind where your participation in the machine is recorded even if you personally remain anonymous. You'll be forgotten as an individual, but the fact that soldiers like you were paid in salt will persist as long as these records survive. You thank the clerk and leave, stepping back into the afternoon sun with thoughts that feel heavier than they should. Your pay is recorded, your service is documented, your small place in the vast military apparatus has been noted by bureaucrats who will never know your name, but who have ensured that your existence is slightly less ephemeral than it would have been otherwise. That night, you lie in your barracks bunk thinking about wax tablets in dusty offices, about clerks copying numbers from one record to another, about the invisible architecture of documentation that supports the visible architecture of empire. Rome doesn't just run on salt and swords and roads. It runs on records, on the accumulated written evidence of transactions and distributions and payments that allow the whole vast system to function without collapsing into chaos. Somewhere in those records is your pay, noted in passing, recorded for posterity, part of the permanent documentation of an empire that might last 1,000 years or might collapse tomorrow, but that at least has the decency to write down what it's doing while it does it. 字数2003. Your final purchase in Rome before the legion marches back to the frontier is a small bronze scale, the kind merchants use to weigh salt and other valuable commodities, precise enough to measure out fair portions but portable enough to carry in a pack. It costs more of your remaining salt than you'd like to spend, but it solves a problem you've been having for months now, never being quite sure whether you're getting fair value when you trade salt for goods. The merchant who sells you the scale is an old man with hands that shake slightly, but eyes that are still sharp, assessing you and your money and your likelihood of being a difficult customer in the time it takes you to walk up to his stall. Military discount, he says before you even ask, because my son serves in the 6th and I like to think someone's giving him fair deals somewhere. The scale he shows you is beautiful in its precision, 2 bronze plates hanging from chains attached to a central beam, all of it small enough to fit in your palm, but engineered with care that speaks to generations of metalworking knowledge. When you place a weight on one plate, the beam tilts with satisfying accuracy, showing exactly how much you need to add to the other plate to achieve balance. It's accurate to half a scripulum, the merchant says proudly, though you're not entirely sure how much a scripulum is, or why you should care about measuring to half of one. Good enough for salt trading, good enough for anything short of jewels and gold, really. You put your salt on one side, the merchant's measuring weight on the other, and when the beam levels, you know you're getting exactly what you're paying for. He demonstrates with a small standardized weight from his collection, placing it on one plate and then carefully adding salt to the other until the beam achieves perfect horizontal balance. See, he says. No guessing, no trusting that the merchant is honest, no arguments about whether a handful is actually a handful. The scale knows, and the scale doesn't lie. You purchase the scale along with a small set of standard weights, 1 libra, half a libra, quarter libra, useful fractions for the kinds of transactions you're likely to make. The whole kit costs you nearly 1/3 of your remaining salt, but it feels like an investment in not being cheated, in having the kind of certainty that soldiers rarely get when dealing with civilian merchants. One more thing, the merchant says as you're packing the scale into your bag. The weights are certified, see the mark here. He points to a small stamp on each bronze weight, a symbol you recognize as official Rome, indicating that these measurements have been verified against the standards kept in the capital. That means any honest merchant will accept them without argument. Dishonest merchants will still try to cheat you, but at least you'll know they're doing it. You thank him and leave, but his words about honest and dishonest merchants stick with you as you navigate back through the market toward your barracks. In your experience, most merchants are neither perfectly honest nor thoroughly dishonest. They're somewhere in the middle, shading transactions in their favor when they can, but not so blatantly that customers stop doing business with them, testing boundaries without crossing them completely. The scale in your pack represents a kind of agreement about how value should be measured, a shared standard that allows trade to function even between people who don't entirely trust each other. Without scales, without standardized weights, without the infrastructure of measurement, commerce would collapse into endless arguments about whether this handful equals that handful, whether you're getting what you paid for or being subtly robbed. Historians love to point out that one of Rome's great achievements was standardizing measurements across the empire, establishing official weights and lengths and volumes that allowed merchants in Gaul to trade with merchants in Syria without having to negotiate what a pound or a foot or a jug actually meant. Before Rome, every city had its own measurements, every region its own standards, and cross-regional trade required constant conversion and verification and arguments about whose standards to use. Rome solved this problem not through force, but through practicality, by making official measurements convenient and trustworthy enough that people preferred using them over local alternatives. The weights in your bag are part of that system, small physical embodiments of imperial authority that make trade possible across vast distances. That evening, you experiment with the scale in your tent, weighing out your remaining salt into precise portions rather than the rough handfuls you've been using. It's oddly satisfying to see the beam achieve perfect balance, to know exactly how much salt you have rather than just estimating based on how the pouch feels when you lift it. Your remaining pay amounts to 1 libra and 3/4 less than you thought based on your pouch's weight, which means you've been overpaying for things, or the pouch itself weighs more than you accounted for, or both. Either way, having actual knowledge instead of rough estimates feels like a small victory against the general chaos of trying to manage your finances on the frontier. One of your tent mates watches you weighing salt with an expression somewhere between amusement and confusion. "You're weighing your pay?" he asks, as if this is the strangest thing he's ever seen someone do with military downtime. "Want to know how much I actually have?" you explain, continuing to transfer salt between the 2 plates of the scale, checking and rechecking to make sure you've measured accurately. "You have enough or you don't," he says with the casual philosophy of someone who's never worried much about having exact knowledge of anything. Knowing the precise amount doesn't change how much salt you can afford to spend. He's wrong, you think, though you don't say it out loud, because arguing philosophy with tent mates is a good way to make enemies you have to sleep next to every night. Knowing the precise amount absolutely changes how much you can afford to spend, because it lets you plan instead of just guessing, budget instead of hoping you have enough when you need it. But more than that, the scale represents a kind of dignity in commerce, the ability to verify that you're being treated fairly, to have evidence rather than just feelings about whether a transaction was honest. You've been cheated before, probably many times, by merchants who shorted handfuls or used their own heavier hands to measure out salt when they were selling to you, and lighter hands when you were selling to them. The scale makes that impossible, or at least much harder. You spend the rest of the evening organizing your salt into measured portions, using small pouches to hold exactly 1 libra, half a libra, quarter libra. It's fiddly work that requires attention and patience, but by the time you're done, you have a much better understanding of your actual financial position and what you can afford before the next payday. The answer is not much. Rome was expensive, your curiosity was expensive, and the scale itself was definitely expensive, though hopefully worth it in the long term. You'll need to be careful for the next few weeks, living on rations instead of buying fresh food, avoiding any purchases that aren't absolutely necessary. But you'll know exactly how much you're spending, exactly how much remains, exactly when you're approaching the danger zone where you don't have enough salt to handle emergencies. That knowledge has value that's hard to quantify but easy to feel, the value of certainty in an uncertain world, of measurement in the face of chaos. That night you dream about scales, enormous bronze scales weighing entire legions against mountains of salt, trying to find a balance that never quite comes, the beam tilting first one way and then the other, while clerks take notes and merchants argue about proper procedure. You wake up confused about what the dream meant, if it meant anything at all, and find your hand reaching automatically for the small scale packed carefully in your bag, checking that it's still there, still real, still capable of telling you truths about value and weight and fairness. The march back to the frontier begins at dawn, and you march with the scale bouncing gently in your pack, one more piece of equipment among many, one more tool for surviving in a world where survival requires both fighting skills and commercial literacy. Rome fades behind you, already becoming memory, but the scale remains physical proof that you were there, that you learned something worth learning, that you're slightly better equipped for the business of living than you were before. Somewhere behind you in the city's markets, merchants are opening their stalls and setting out their scales, preparing for another day of commerce and negotiation and the endless human effort to determine what things are worth and whether trades are fair. You're part of that system now in a more conscious way than before, carrying the tools to participate on more equal terms, ready to measure instead of guess. The salt at your hip has transformed from a vague, heavy presence into a precisely known quantity, 1 libra and 3/4, measured and verified, understood rather than just felt. It's the same salt, the same white crystals, but now you know them better, have established a relationship based on accuracy rather than approximation. And somehow that changes everything, or at least changes how you think about everything, which might amount to the same thing in the end. 字数2051, back at your frontier posting after 3 weeks of marching. The first thing you notice is how small and insignificant everything seems compared to Rome. The camp that felt substantial when you left now looks like a temporary arrangement that could blow away in a strong wind. The nearby town that served as your main connection to civilian life now seems barely worthy of the name town, just a collection of buildings clustered around the road like they're hoping something important will eventually happen here. But there are compensations for being back on the frontier, and one of them arrives 3 days after your return in the form of a merchant caravan that's been traveling the same circuit for longer than you've been alive. The merchant is a Greek named Alexios, who speaks Latin with an accent that makes everything sound like a question, and his specialty is preserved goods from across the Mediterranean, things that keep well enough to survive the journey to the edge of the empire, where soldiers like you will pay premium prices for tastes of home. What catches your attention among his goods are the olives, not fresh olives, which would never survive the journey, but olives preserved in salt and packed into clay jars that seal tight enough to keep air and moisture out for months. You haven't had a good olive since you left Rome, and before that you can't even remember the last time, and suddenly the prospect of having olives again seems worth whatever salt it costs. From Greece, originally, Alexios explains when he sees you examining the jars, but these particular ones come from a grove outside Tarentum. Harvested last autumn, packed in salt immediately, still good for another 6 months at least if you store them properly. He opens one of the jars to show you the contents, dark olives completely encrusted with white salt, each one individual and perfect, waiting to be freed from their preserving layer and eaten. The smell that wafts up is intense and complex brine and olive oil, and something earthy that must be the olive flesh itself, all of it concentrated by the preservation process into an aroma more powerful than any fresh olive could produce. How do you prepare them? You ask, because you've never actually dealt with salt-preserved olives before and don't want to ruin them through ignorance. Rinse the salt off with water, Alexios says, demonstrating by pulling out a single olive and dunking it in a bowl of water he keeps nearby, specifically for this purpose. The white salt dissolves immediately, running off the dark skin like snow melting off stone, revealing the olive underneath looking almost exactly like it did when it was first picked. Some people like to soak them for a while to pull out more salt. Others eat them right after rinsing. Depends on your taste. He offers you the rinsed olive, and you eat it slowly, paying attention to flavors you haven't experienced in months. The salt has penetrated the flesh. Obviously, you can taste it clearly, a background note that enhances rather than overwhelms the olive's natural flavors. But there's something else too, a depth that fresh olives don't have, as if the preservation process has concentrated the essence of oliveness into something more intense than nature originally provided. I'll take a jar, you say, already calculating how much salt this will cost and whether you can afford it given your depleted reserves from Rome. Half a libra for a jar this size, Alexios says, tapping the clay vessel, or you can buy them by the olive if you want to be more careful with your salt, though that works out more expensive per olive in the end. Half a libra is more than you wanted to spend, but the memory of that single olive's taste is already making your mouth water, and you haven't tasted anything this good since leaving Rome. You pull out your scale the first time you're using it for an actual transaction, and Alexios's expression shifts into something like respect when he sees the certified weights. "A soldier with a proper scale," he says, clearly impressed. "You're smarter than most, I'll give you that. Half the boys out here just pour salt into my hand and trust that I'm being honest, which of course I am because repeat business requires reputation, but still nice to see someone who verifies." The transaction proceeds with satisfying precision. You measure out exactly half a libra of salt. He verifies the amount with his own scale, which matches yours perfectly, and the jar of olives changes ownership, with both parties confident they've gotten fair value. It's a small thing, this moment of commercial accuracy, but it feels significant after months of approximate trades based on trust and hope. That night you eat 3 of the olives, rinsing them carefully and savoring each one like it might be the last good food you have for months. Which it very well might be, given how quickly your salt is disappearing and how slowly payday approaches. But the olives are worth it, intensely flavorful in a way that makes camp rations seem even more bland by comparison. Each one a small explosion of Mediterranean sunshine captured in preserved flesh. You find yourself thinking about the olives as you eat them, about the journey they made from a grove outside Tarentum to this frontier camp to your mouth. Someone picked these olives from trees, sorted them, packed them in salt, specifically for long-distance transport. Alexios bought them from that someone, added his markup, carried them hundreds of miles along roads that are sometimes safe and sometimes decidedly not. And now they're food, fuel for a body that needs to be ready to fight or march or stand guard at a moment's notice. The circle from production to preservation to transportation to consumption, all of it made possible by salt's ability to keep things from rotting long enough to get where they need to go. Historians have noted that the Mediterranean diet, the foods that characterized Greek and Roman eating for centuries, was fundamentally shaped by salt preservation. Not just because salt made it possible to preserve olives and fish and other foods, but because the need to preserve food for long-term storage influenced what people grew and how they prepared it. Olives are well suited to salt preservation in ways that many other fruits aren't, which partially explains why olives became so central to Mediterranean agriculture and cuisine. The same logic applies to fish. The species that preserve well in salt became dietary staples, while those that don't preserve well remained occasional luxuries requiring proximity to fresh water. Salt shaped not just how people ate, but what they ate, creating feedback loops where preservation methods influenced food production, which influenced preservation methods in an endless cycle of mutual adaptation. You're eating a product of that cycle right now, each olive a small result of thousands of years of people figuring out how to make food last longer than nature intended. The salt that preserved these olives probably came from the same coastal ponds that produce the salt in your pay pouch, might have been harvested by workers with white-stained hands standing in brine under the same sun that ripened the olives themselves. There's a symmetry to it that appeals to you, even though you can't quite explain why salt from the sea, preserving olives from the land, Mediterranean products traveling together to the frontier, both of them essential to keeping the empire functioning at this distance from its center. Without preserved foods, the frontier garrisons would have to be self-sufficient or situated close enough to agricultural areas to receive fresh supplies daily. With preserved foods, outposts can exist anywhere there's water and defensible ground, regardless of local food production. You seal the jar carefully after taking your 3 olives, making sure moisture and air can't get in to spoil what remains. At 3 olives per night, an arbitrary limit you've set for yourself to make them last, the jar will provide flavor for nearly a month, carrying you most of the way to the next payday. It's extravagant, spending half a libra of salt on olives you don't technically need, but the way you figure it, what's the point of getting paid if you can't occasionally have something that makes life worth living? The jar sits on your wooden chest, clay and salt and preserved olives from a grove you'll never see, payment for salt harvested from ponds you'll never visit, part of a trading network that connects the entire Mediterranean world, whether anyone realizes it or not. Tomorrow you'll eat 3 more olives, and the day after that 3 more, and gradually the jar will empty, and eventually you'll throw away the clay vessel and forget exactly how the olives tasted. But for now, with the taste still sharp in your mouth and the jar still mostly full on your chest, you feel connected to something larger than frontier life, connected to Greece and Italy and the sea itself. All of it linked through salt and trade and the human drive to make food last longer than nature allows. Salt preserves food, but it also preserves connections, preserves culture, preserves the possibility of eating olives from Tarentum while stationed at the edge of the known world. That's worth half a libra of salt, worth the calculation and the sacrifice and the careful rationing that will make the jar last as long as possible. You fall asleep thinking about olive groves you'll never walk through, about workers you'll never meet who pick the fruit you're eating, about the invisible threads of commerce that connect everyone in the empire, whether they're conscious of it or not. The jar sits on your chest, sealed against time and decay, a small victory of preservation in a world where everything eventually falls apart. 字数2019. A month after buying the olives, you receive orders for another patrol that takes you back along the coastal route where you once watched the salt worker harvesting crystals from her ponds. You're curious whether she's still there, though of course she is. Where else would she be? And whether she remembers the soldier who stopped to watch her work and ask strange questions about salt and hands and labor. She's there, as expected, working a different pond this time, but with the same steady rhythm you remember from before. When you stop at a respectful distance, close enough to watch but far enough to not be intrusive, she looks up and recognizes you immediately, her expression shifting into something that might be amusement or might be resignation, that she's going to have to entertain another conversation with a curious soldier. Back again, she calls out, leaning on her rake, the same way she did last time, in that posture that suggests her back never stopped hurting in the months between your visits. Different patrol, same road, you explain, though she probably doesn't care about the logistics of your military duties. Thought I'd see how the harvest is going. She laughs at that, a sound that's genuine rather than polite. The harvest goes like it always goes, she says. Seawater comes in, sun evaporates it, salt remains. Same as it was last month, same as it'll be next month, same as it's been since my grandmother was doing this work and probably since before Rome existed. 小于井号2, 5 hash, is greater than. You gesture toward the ponds, asking silent permission to approach closer, and she nods in a way that suggests she doesn't mind the company, or at least doesn't mind enough to refuse it. Up close, the ponds are more impressive than you remembered each one. A perfect shallow rectangle carved into the hillside, lined with clay to prevent seepage, connected by sluice gates that control the flow of water from one pond to the next. The lowest ponds closest to the sea are filled with water that looks barely different from the ocean itself, maybe slightly calmer, maybe slightly warmer from sitting in the sun. The middle ponds are noticeably thicker, the water taking on a quality that's less liquid and more syrupy, though it's still clearly water rather than brine. And the highest ponds, the ones she's currently working, are crusted white with salt, the crystals thick enough that they crunch underfoot when you walk along the pond's edge. How long does the whole process take? You ask, gesturing from the lowest pond to the highest. Depends on the weather, she says, returning to her raking while she talks, the conversation not important enough to interrupt her work. Hot sun and dry wind, maybe a month from seawater to harvestable salt. Cloudy weather or rain, longer, sometimes much longer, if the gods decide they don't want us to have salt this season. Do you lose the salt if it rains? You ask, realizing suddenly that you have no idea how salt production actually works beyond the basic principle of evaporation. Some of it, she admits. Rain dilutes the brine, washes away crystals that haven't been harvested yet, sets the whole process back to wherever the rain stops falling. Bad storms can wipe out weeks of work, though the salt itself doesn't disappear, it just dissolves back into solution, and you have to wait for the sun to evaporate the water all over again. She pauses in her raking to look directly at you, her expression serious in a way that makes you pay closer attention than you were before. You know what's strange about this work? She says. I'm harvesting something that will exist forever, no matter what I do or don't do. The salt is already in the seawater. I'm just removing the water to reveal what was always there. If I didn't harvest it, it would form anyway eventually, maybe on a beach somewhere, maybe in a tidal pool, maybe in places no human will ever see. The salt doesn't care whether I exist or not. But Rome cares, you point out, thinking about the warehouses and the pay wagons and the entire military system that depends on workers like her doing exactly this work. Rome cares about having salt when and where Rome wants it, she corrects. Rome cares about efficiency and supply, and making sure soldiers like you get paid on time. But the salt itself? The salt was here before Rome, will be here after Rome, doesn't need human civilization to exist, even though human civilization seems to need it. It's the most philosophical thing you've heard from someone who works with their hands for a living, and it makes you reconsider assumptions you didn't even know you had about who thinks about these things and who doesn't. Of course, she thinks about salt in ways that go beyond just harvesting it. She spends her entire life with the substance, sees it in all its forms from dissolved minerals to finished crystals, understands its nature better than any scholar who only encounters it after someone else has done the work of extracting it. Historians still debate whether salt formation is a chemical process or a physical one, whether something fundamentally changes when sodium chloride crystallizes out of solution, or whether it's just a change of state like water freezing into ice. The debate seems academic from where you're standing, watching crystals form in real time through a process that predates human understanding of chemistry or physics, or any other formal science. "Can I try?" you ask, gesturing at the rake, suddenly wanting to experience this work firsthand rather than just observing it from a distance. She looks surprised but hands over the tool without argument, stepping back to watch you attempt what she makes look easy. The rake is heavier than you expected, weighted with years of use that have shaped the wood to her hands rather than yours. You step into the pond. The water is shin deep and surprisingly warm, heated by days of sun exposure to a temperature that would be pleasant if it wasn't also supersaturated with salt. You pull the rake through the salt crust the way you saw her doing it, trying to scrape the crystals into piles without disturbing the underlying clay too much. It's harder than it looks. The salt resists the rake in ways that mud or dirt wouldn't, forming clumps that need to be broken up, sticking to the wooden tines in crusts that have to be knocked loose, generally behaving like a substance that has opinions about how it should be treated. Your hands start burning after maybe 2 minutes of raking, not painful exactly, but a tingling sensation that tells you the salt is already starting its work on your skin, drawing out moisture, creating the conditions for the white stains you saw on her hands. How she does this all day, every day, year after year, you can't imagine. Your respect for the physical difficulty of her work increases dramatically in the time it takes you to rake maybe a square meter of salt into a pile. Hard work, you say, stating the obvious because you can't think of anything else to say that wouldn't sound condescending or stupid. "Everything worth doing is hard work," she responds, taking back the rake and immediately correcting your pile, redistributing the salt you gathered into a shape that's apparently more efficient for basket loading. The trick is finding work where the hardness is worth something to someone. Salt is worth something to everyone, which means this particular hardness has value, which means I eat and have shelter and continue existing. Could be worse. You wash your hands in the next pond down the slope, watching the salt dissolve off your skin and disappear back into the brine from which it came, the cycle continuing in miniature. Your hands feel strange, now drier than before, slightly tight, like the salt took more moisture than just what was on the surface. You can't imagine what it feels like to have this sensation permanently, to have your hands transformed by years of constant salt contact into something that never quite feels normal again. "Thank you for letting me try," you say, meaning it more than you usually mean such polite phrases. Come back in a few years if you survive your service, she says, returning to her raking with the same rhythm she had before, the brief interruption already absorbed back into the endless pattern of her work. I'll still be here, or someone like me will be, doing the same work under the same sun. Salt is forever, which means jobs harvesting it are forever, which means there's a kind of security in this work that you don't get in many other places. You leave her to it, rejoining your patrol and continuing along the coastal road toward whatever destination the army has decided you need to reach today. But the feeling of the rake in your hands persists, and the tightness of your salt-dried skin persists, and the image of her working those ponds day after day persists in your mind in ways that make the salt in your pouch feel different, heavier with knowledge, weighted with understanding of the labor required to produce it. That night, you examine the salt in your pay pouch more carefully than usual, looking for differences between crystals, trying to guess which came from ponds like the ones you saw and which came from large industrial operations where the process is more mechanized and less personal. Of course, you can't tell salt is salt, crystals are crystals, and the romance you're trying to impose on the substance isn't actually visible in its physical form. But knowing what you know now, having felt the rake and the warm brine and the way salt forms in layers that need to be scraped and gathered and processed, the salt feels different anyway. More real, more connected to actual work by actual people, less abstract as a currency and more concrete as a product of labor. The evaporation ponds continue their work whether you think about them or not. Seawater flowing in, sun and wind doing their work, crystals forming in patterns that have repeated for millions of years before humans started harvesting them and will continue for millions of years after we're gone. You're just passing through this system, collecting your small portion, participating briefly in cycles that are vastly larger and longer than your individual life. But you've touched those cycles now, have put your hands in brine and felt salt form against your skin, have experienced for yourself the process that produces the white gold that pays your wages and feeds your empire. That knowledge doesn't change anything practical about your life or your service or your relationship with salt. But it changes something anyway, some intangible sense of connection, of understanding, of knowing where things come from and what it costs to bring them into being. 字数2063. Your unit receives unexpected orders 3 months later, reassignment to a garrison across the Mediterranean, which means your first experience with sea travel since joining the Legion. Most of your fellow soldiers are either excited about the voyage or terrified of it, with very little middle ground between those two reactions. You find yourself in the middle, curious about experiencing ship travel but aware enough of the dangers to be appropriately cautious. The transport ship is larger than any vessel you've seen before, a merchant galley that's been temporarily commissioned for military use, with space for 2 full cohorts, plus supplies and equipment. The hold is already partially loaded when you arrive at the harbour. You can see crates and barrels being carried aboard by dock workers who move with the practiced efficiency of people who've done this job thousands of times and will do it thousands more. What catches your attention among the cargo are the salt barrels, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, each one sealed with wax to prevent moisture getting in, and marked with symbols that probably indicate origin and quality and other details that matter to merchants and quartermasters. The sheer quantity of salt being loaded onto this single ship exceeds what you've seen in one place except for the warehouses in Rome, and even that's hard to compare because warehouses are stationary, while this salt is about to travel across the sea to wherever the ship is heading after it drops you off. You end up in conversation with one of the ship's permanent crew, an old sailor named Marcus, who's been working Mediterranean trade routes since before you were born, and who seems genuinely pleased to have someone interested in cargo, instead of just wanting to know when the ship will arrive at its destination. Salt is good cargo, he tells you, settling into the kind of lecture that suggests he's been waiting for someone to ask about this topic. Heavy, which helps with ballast and stability. Valuable enough to justify the shipping costs, but not so valuable you need an armed escort, though it doesn't hurt to have you soldiers aboard just in case. Doesn't spoil if you pack it right. Doesn't attract rats like grain does. Doesn't leak like wine barrels sometimes do. Good cargo all around. Where is all this salt going, you ask, gesturing at the barrels still being loaded into the hold. Different places, he says. Some goes to your garrison for military pay and food preservation. Some goes to merchant warehouses in the port cities along our route. Some is already sold to specific buyers who'll be waiting when we arrive. Salt moves around the empire like blood moves around a body, constantly circulating, always necessary, carrying value from places that have it to places that need it. He leads you to the cargo hold, navigating the narrow stairs with confidence that comes from years of practice into the dark, cramped space where the ship's cargo is stored. It smells like salt and wood and seawater, a combination that's somehow both pleasant and slightly overwhelming. The salt barrels are stacked in carefully calculated patterns that Marcus explains maximize use of space while maintaining proper weight distribution. Can't load it all on one side or the ship lists, he explains, tapping one of the barrels affectionately, like it's a favorite tool or a trusted colleague. Can't stack it too high or it'll shift in heavy seas and potentially capsize us. Can't pack it too tight, or we can't get to the other cargo if we need to unload something at an intermediate port. Loading cargo properly is an art, and salt is one of the easier things to work with once you understand its properties. Historians sometimes write about Rome's maritime trade as if it was primarily about grain and olive oil and wine, the glamorous luxury goods that represent Mediterranean commerce in people's imaginations. But Marcus's perspective suggests that salt is at least as important as those other commodities, maybe more so because of its universal necessity and relative ease of transport. How often does salt get lost at sea, you ask, suddenly aware that you're standing in a wooden vessel that will shortly be floating on water that's perfectly capable of sinking ships if conditions are bad enough. Happens, Marcus admits. Storm comes up, ship goes down, cargo goes to the bottom of the sea. though in the case of salt, there's a kind of poetry to it, the salt returning to the ocean it originally came from, dissolving back into solution, rejoining the vast reservoir from which it was extracted. Not much consolation to the merchants who paid for it, or the sailors who drowned with it, but poetry nonetheless. He's quiet for a moment, presumably remembering colleagues who didn't survive to become old sailors giving lectures about cargo to curious soldiers, and you don't push him to continue. The hold creaks with the small movements of the ship at dock, timbers settling, water lapping against the hull, the constant background sounds of a vessel that's more home to Marcus than any building on land could ever be. But mostly the salt makes it to its destination, he continues, shaking off whatever memories were occupying his thoughts. We've gotten good at this over the centuries, reading weather, choosing routes, knowing when to wait out storms and when to risk the crossing. The Mediterranean is dangerous but predictable if you respect it and pay attention to what it's telling you. The voyage itself, when it begins 2 days later, is both more boring and more terrifying than you expected. Boring because most of sea travel involves sitting around waiting for wind and watching water that looks exactly like it did an hour ago and will look exactly the same an hour from now. Terrifying because occasionally the sea decides to remind you that you're floating on water that could easily kill you if it chose to, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it except hold on and hope the sailors know their business. You spend a lot of time thinking about the salt in the hold below you, about how it's making the same journey you're making but as cargo rather than passenger, about how it will be distributed after arrival to soldiers like you who will never know which specific barrel their pay came from or what ship carried it across the sea. The salt is more connected to the ship than you are in a way it belongs here, is natural cargo for a vessel that exists primarily to move goods from one place to another, while you're just a temporary passenger using the ship for purposes it wasn't originally designed for. On the 3rd day of the voyage, a storm hits, not catastrophic but definitely concerning. Waves that wash over the deck and winds that make the sails scream, and sailors who suddenly look less confident and more focused on keeping the ship from doing whatever it is ships do when storms overwhelm them. You huddle below deck with the other soldiers, trying not to think about the cargo hold full of salt barrels that could shift and unbalance the ship, trying not to imagine what drowning would feel like, trying and failing to maintain the calm, professional demeanor that soldiers are supposed to have in all circumstances. But the storm passes, as storms do if you're lucky, and the ship survives, and Marcus finds you later looking somewhat shaky, and gives you a flask of wine that burns going down but settles your nerves in a way that nothing else quite could. "The salt's fine," he says, as if he knows exactly what you were worrying about even though you never mentioned it. "Barrels are secure, cargo didn't shift, ship's still properly balanced. We'll make port tomorrow morning right on schedule, and all that salt will get where it's supposed to go, and the Empire will continue functioning, because that's what the Empire does. It continues functioning even when individual moments feel like everything's about to fall apart." He's right. You arrive at your destination the next morning, tired and slightly traumatized by the storm, but alive and ready to start whatever service the army has planned for you in this new garrison. The salt gets unloaded along with all the other cargo, and you watch the barrels being carried down the gangplank and loaded onto wagons and dispersed to wherever they need to go. You'll receive your next pay in a few weeks, and some of that salt might be from the barrels you traveled with, or it might be from completely different sources that arrived by different routes at different times. There's no way to know, no way to trace the specific crystals back to their specific origins, and maybe that's the point. Salt is fungible, interchangeable, valued not for its individual history, but for its universal properties that make it useful regardless of where it came from. But having traveled with salt, having watched it survive storms that could have sent it back to the ocean, having seen the care that goes into moving it safely from producers to consumers, you feel differently about the white crystals in your pay pouch. They traveled to reach you, crossed seas and survived dangers, participated in commerce and logistics and the vast distributed effort that makes empire possible. That night, in your new garrison quarters, you pour out a small amount of salt and taste it on your tongue, trying to detect any trace of the ship or the storm or the journey in its flavor. Of course, there's nothing salt tastes like salt, the same as it always has and always will. But you know more about where it came from now, understand better what it took to get it to you, and somehow that knowledge changes the taste anyway. The salt dissolves on your tongue and enters your body and becomes part of you, the same salt that was part of the ocean and part of a coastal pond and part of a ship's cargo and now part of your blood and sweat and tears. The cycle continues, as it always has and always will, connecting everything to everything else through transformations that are both physical and commercial, natural and human, simple and impossibly complex. 字数2025. Your new garrison turns out to be more permanent than the last one, with actual stone buildings instead of tents, with a proper mess hall instead of individual cooking fires, with infrastructure that suggests Rome expects to be here for decades, if not centuries. But even with a centralized kitchen, soldiers are still allowed, encouraged, really to supplement their rations with personal cooking, and you find yourself spending more and more time at your tent's small fire pit, preparing meals that bear some resemblance to the food you remember from before joining the Legion. The cooking pot you've been using is the same battered iron vessel you were issued during training, dented and blackened by years of use but still functional, still capable of turning raw ingredients and water and heat into something edible. And increasingly, you're noticing how much of your cooking revolves around salt, not just as a seasoning added at the end, but as a fundamental ingredient that determines what you can cook and how you cook it. Tonight's meal is a stew made from salted pork, the kind that's been packed in brine and can last for months without spoiling. You rinse the pork thoroughly to remove excess salt, then cut it into chunks and add it to the pot with water and whatever vegetables you could barter for at the market. The pork is so saturated with salt from its preservation that even after rinsing, it flavors the entire pot, eliminating any need to add salt as a separate seasoning. The process makes you think about salt's role in cooking, how it's simultaneously a preservative, a seasoning, and a transformative agent that changes the chemistry of food in ways you don't fully understand but can definitely taste. The pork would have rotted weeks ago without salt's intervention. But the salt didn't just prevent decay, it actually changed the pork's texture and flavor, making it denser and more intensely porky than fresh meat could ever be. One of your tent mates, a younger soldier named Gaius, who joined the Legion specifically to escape farm work, and is now discovering that farm work might have been preferable to frontier garrison duty, watches you cook with the intensity of someone who's tired of eating nothing but bread and porridge. "How much salt did you use?" he asks, presumably hoping to recreate this meal himself at some point. "None directly," you explain, stirring the pot to distribute heat more evenly. The pork was preserved in salt, and enough of that salt stayed in the meat to flavor everything else in the pot. That's the thing about salt. Once you understand how preservation works, you can use preserved ingredients as both food and seasoning simultaneously. He considers this with the expression of someone having a small revelation, like he's suddenly seeing connections he never noticed before, even though he's been eating salted meat his entire life. "So the salt I get paid with could preserve the food I buy with the salt I didn't use for preservation?" he asks, working through the logic out loud. "Exactly," you confirm, though his phrasing makes the process sound more complicated than it actually is. Salt is both currency and ingredient, both payment and product. That's what makes it such a good basis for military wages. You can spend it or you can use it, and either way it has value. The stew bubbles away while you talk, filling the immediate area with smells that attract other soldiers like moths to a flame, all of them suddenly very interested in whether you cooked enough to share. You didn't. The amount of salted pork you had was enough for maybe 2 portions, and you'd planned on eating both yourself over 2 days, but the social pressure of soldiers who smell good food and haven't had good food in recent memory is hard to resist. You end up sharing the stew among 5 people, which means everyone gets less than a full meal, but also means you've earned social capital that might matter later when you're the one smelling someone else's cooking and hoping for a share. This is how garrison life works, in formal economies of favor and reciprocity that run parallel to the official economy of pay and rations. Equally important, even though no bureaucrat in Rome records them in ledgers. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" one of the other soldiers asks through a mouthful of stew, and you realize you don't have a good answer because you didn't really learn it anywhere. You just paid attention to how your mother cooked and what the camp cooks did, and made reasonable guesses about how to combine those approaches. Historians sometimes write about Roman cuisine as if it was a single unified thing, a set of recipes and techniques that every Roman learned and applied consistently across the empire. But the reality is more chaotic, and interesting people cooked with whatever ingredients they had access to, using whatever methods worked in their particular circumstances, adapting regional traditions to local availability in ways that created enormous variation under the broad umbrella of Roman cooking. The one constant seems to be salt. Every Roman meal involves salt in some form, as a preservative in the ingredients, as a seasoning in the cooking, as a finishing touch sprinkled on food just before eating. You've never had a meal without salt and can barely imagine what such a meal would taste like, how food could be appealing without the chemical enhancement that salt provides. As you scrape out your portion of the stew, smaller than you'd like but adequate for the evening, you find yourself calculating how much salt was involved in this single meal. The pork was preserved in maybe half a libra of salt originally, though most of that was rinsed away and only a fraction remained in the meat. So maybe the equivalent of a handful of salt, which you didn't pay for directly because you bought the preserved pork rather than fresh pork and salt separately. But someone paid for that salt, the merchant who bought the fresh pork and preserved it, or the farmer who preserved it himself before bringing it to market, or whoever in the chain of production and distribution decided that this particular pig should be transformed into preserved meat rather than sold fresh. The economics are complicated and overlapping in ways that make your head hurt when you think about them too carefully. What's clearer is that salt made this meal possible, not just in the sense of making it taste good, though it did that, but in the more fundamental sense that without salt preservation, this pork would never have made it from wherever it was originally slaughtered to this garrison on the frontier where you cooked it into stew. Fresh pork doesn't travel well, spoils within days in any climate warmer than winter, requires either immediate cooking or some method of preservation to remain edible. Salt turned temporary pork into permanent pork, turned a local product into a tradable commodity, turned something that would have fed one family near the source into something that could feed hundreds of soldiers far from anywhere pigs are raised. That transformation from perishable to preserved, from local to transportable, is maybe salt's most important function, more significant than its role as currency or seasoning or any other use you've encountered. The fire dies down as evening settles into night, and you scrub out the cooking pot with sand and water, removing the residue of the stew so it doesn't contaminate whatever you cook next. The pot is permanently discolored by years of use, blackened around the bottom where it sits in flames, stained inside by countless meals that left traces of themselves in the iron. But it's still functional, still capable of transforming ingredients into meals, still one of your most valuable possessions, even though it's worth almost nothing in commercial terms. You think about all the meals this pot has produced, all the times it's turned raw materials and heat and time into something that kept you alive. Hundreds of meals at least, maybe thousands if you count the small portions and the shared stews and the times you cooked for others who couldn't or wouldn't cook for themselves. And at the center of almost every one of those meals was salt, invisible but essential, present in the ingredients and the seasoning and the very water you used to cook with if you were near the coast. Salt is everywhere. You realize not just in your pay pouch, but in every aspect of survival on the frontier, in every meal, and every preserved food, and every calculation about what you can eat, and when, and how to make it last, until the next supply caravan arrives. You've been living inside a salt economy for years without fully recognizing it, participating in systems and processes that all ultimately trace back to those coastal ponds where workers with white-stained hands scrape crystals from brine under the Mediterranean sun. That night you add a pinch of salt to your water ration, Something you've heard prevents the stomach sickness that comes from drinking water that's been sitting in leather flasks too long. Whether it actually works or is just soldier superstition, you don't know, but the water tastes better with salt in it anyway, less flat and lifeless, more like something worth drinking rather than just something you drink because you have to. The salt dissolves into invisibility, but its presence remains obvious in the taste, in the way your body responds to the chemical signals that salt provides, in the subtle sense that this water is now optimized for human consumption in ways that pure water isn't. Salt makes everything better, or at least makes everything more suited to keeping humans alive, which amounts to the same thing from where you're sitting. You fall asleep with the taste of salted water still on your tongue and the smell of stew still lingering in your tent, both of them reminders that you successfully fed yourself today through a combination of military pay, commercial exchange, and cooking skills that are just adequate enough to turn ingredients into meals. Tomorrow you'll do it again, and the day after that, and the salt will continue flowing through your life whether you pay attention to it or take it for granted. 字数2068. 6 months into your posting at this new garrison, you end up on an escort detail that's more administrative than military, accompanying a tax collector on his rounds through the salt-producing regions near the coast, providing security in case anyone objects too strongly to paying taxes on their salt harvests. The tax collector is a thin, nervous man named Quintus, who seems perpetually worried that someone is going to stab him over tax policy, which is not an entirely unreasonable fear, given the history of tax collectors in provinces that feel overtaxed and underserved by Rome. But the salt workers you visit seem more resigned than angry, treating the tax collection as an inevitable imposition rather than an outrageous injustice. They know the taxes are coming, know approximately how much they'll have to pay, know that resistance is futile, and compliance at least lets them continue working their ponds in peace. It's a pragmatic approach to taxation that seems depressing when you first encounter it, but makes more sense the more you think about it. Quintus explains the tax system as you travel between salt works, partially because he's nervous and talking helps calm him down, partially because he seems genuinely interested in his work in a way that most bureaucrats aren't. The salt tax is one of Rome's oldest revenue sources, he says, consulting his tablets to make sure he's remembering the details correctly. Some historians claim it predates the Republic, though records from that period are fragmentary and unreliable. How much does Rome collect from salt taxes, you ask, curious now about the scale of the system you've been participating in without understanding its fiscal dimensions. Millions of sestertii per year across the whole empire, Quintus says, his voice taking on the slightly awed tone of someone discussing numbers too large to meaningfully comprehend. Though that's just the direct taxes on salt production and trade. If you include the broader economic activity that salt makes possible, preserved food trade, long-distance commerce, military supply chains, the total value is probably impossible to calculate accurately. He shows you his tax records from previous collections, pages and pages of neat notation recording who produced how much salt, what rate they were taxed at, what they actually paid versus what they theoretically owed, notes about disputed amounts and negotiated settlements, and cases where collectors accepted salt instead of coin, because that's what the producers had available to pay with. Do people ever refuse to pay? You ask, wondering if that's why you're here to provide muscle, if negotiations turn hostile. Sometimes, Quintus admits, though less often than you might think. Most people understand that taxes are the price of Roman protection, Roman roads, Roman stability. They might grumble, might try to negotiate the amount, might claim they produced less salt than they actually did, but outright refusal is rare because the consequences are too severe. We can confiscate entire operations, ban people from salt production, fine them amounts that exceed their total annual production. Better to pay the tax and keep working. It's a grimly practical explanation of power dynamics, delivered in Quintus's nervous, scholarly tone that makes it sound less threatening than it actually is. The empire runs on taxes, and those taxes are ultimately backed by force, and you're the physical manifestation of that force, even though you've never actually had to threaten anyone during this whole escort detail. Just being present in your military uniform is enough to remind everyone involved that Rome can enforce its tax policies if it chooses to. Historians still debate whether Rome's tax system was exceptionally efficient for its time, or just average but better documented than competing empires. Quintus has opinions on this debate, which he shares at length during the long walks between salt works, citing specific scholars and their arguments with the enthusiasm of someone who thinks deeply about Roman fiscal policy and rarely gets to discuss it with anyone who will listen. What becomes clear from his explanations is that the salt tax serves multiple purposes beyond just raising revenue. By taxing salt production, Rome creates records of where salt is produced and in what quantities, which helps with supply planning and military provisioning. By requiring producers to register and pay taxes, Rome establishes legal oversight of the salt trade, making it harder for unauthorized operations to undercut official prices or disrupt supply chains. And by accepting salt as payment for taxes in regions where coin is scarce, Rome ensures its own warehouses stay stocked with the commodity it needs to pay its soldiers and feed its cities. It's an elegant system when you understand how all the pieces fit together, though elegant might not be the word that salt workers would use to describe having to hand over portions of their harvest to tax collectors who appear periodically to extract value from their labor. At one of the larger salt works, you meet a woman who reminds you of the harvester you spoke with months earlier, older, weathered by sun and salt, hands permanently stained white, the physical embodiment of lifetime salt work. She pays her taxes without arguing, counting out the required amount in salt with the precision of someone who's done this calculation many times and knows exactly how much she owes. But after Quintus finishes his paperwork and moves on to process the next producer, she turns to you with an expression you can't quite read. "You get paid in salt," she says, not a question, just a statement of fact that she's somehow certain of despite never having met you before. I do, you confirm, wondering where this is going. Some of that salt is mine, she says, gesturing at the ponds behind her, at the white crust glittering in the afternoon sun. I harvest it, Rome taxes it, your quartermaster distributes it, you receive it as pay. My labor becomes your wage, and somewhere in between, Rome takes its share for making the whole system possible. She's not angry about this, doesn't seem to be making an accusation or demanding acknowledgement of injustice. She's just stating facts, describing the chain of production and taxation and distribution that connects her labor to your survival, making explicit what usually remains implicit in economic transactions. Thank you, you say, because it seems like the only appropriate response to having someone clearly articulate their role in keeping you alive. She shrugs, not dismissively, but as if thanks are beside the point. It's work, she says. Same work my family has done for generations. Same work we'll probably do for generations more if Rome continues needing salt and we continue having ponds to harvest it from. I'm not looking for gratitude, just recognition that what I do matters, that it's connected to what you do, that we're both part of the same system whether we chose to be or not. You think about this conversation long after the escort detail ends and you're back at your regular garrison duties. Think about the invisible threads connecting you to salt workers you'll never meet, to tax collectors you escort but don't particularly understand, to bureaucrats in Rome managing fiscal policies that determine how much of your pay is salt and how much might eventually be coin if the empire's currency situation ever stabilizes. That night, when you pour out salt to season your evening meal, you find yourself wondering whose labor these particular crystals represent, whose hands touched them before they reached you, whose taxes funded the administrative overhead that made the transaction possible. The salt doesn't answer these questions, it just dissolves into your food the way it always does, providing flavor and preservation without regard for the complex human systems that brought it to this moment. But you know the answers now, or at least know enough to understand that every crystal represents labor and taxation and distribution, represents human effort at multiple points in the supply chain, represents an empire's successful imposition of order on the chaos of market forces and individual self-interest. Rome works because systems like this work, because people pay their taxes, and soldiers protect the tax collectors, and the salt keeps flowing from producers to consumers in patterns that have persisted for centuries. You fall asleep thinking about tax tablets and salt ponds and the woman who recognized you as the end point of her labor, all of it connected through administrative networks that most people never see or think about, but that make everything else possible. The salt at your hip is taxed salt, regulated salt, officially recorded and properly accounted for, part of a fiscal system that's larger than any individual, but that only works because individuals participate in it, whether they fully understand it or not. 字数2004 years pass as they do, and you find yourself approaching the end of your military service with a mixture of relief and uncertainty about what comes after. You've been paid in salt for so long that it's become your primary way of thinking about value, your instinctive unit of measurement when evaluating whether something is expensive or cheap, worth pursuing or worth avoiding. Your final pay as a soldier is 3 libre of salt, the same amount you received at your first payday years ago, though somehow both the salt and you have changed in ways that are hard to articulate. The salt is still white crystals, still harvested from coastal ponds, still capable of preserving food and seasoning meals, and serving as currency throughout the empire. But your relationship to it has transformed through years of experience, from simple acceptance of military wages to deep understanding of the systems and labor that make those wages possible. You've watched salt being harvested from ponds, been inside the warehouses where it's stored, traveled with it aboard ships, paid taxes on it, cooked with it, traded it for goods across half the empire, used it to survive in circumstances where survival wasn't guaranteed. The salt that once seemed like just another aspect of Legion life now feels like the thread connecting everything you've experienced, the constant presence that linked all those disconnected moments into a coherent narrative about value and labor and empire. On your last night in the garrison before departing for civilian life, you sit by the fire with the same battered cooking pot you've been using for years, preparing a final meal as a soldier. The ingredients are nothing special: salted fish, some vegetables bartered from a local farmer, water from the camp well, but the act of cooking them feels ceremonial in a way that ordinary meals don't, like you're marking a transition between one phase of life and whatever comes next. Other veterans have told you that leaving military service is harder than joining it, that the structure and certainty of Legion life becomes something you miss even when you hated it at the time, that civilian existence feels disorganized and purposeless after years of being told exactly what to do and when to do it. You're not sure you believe them. You've been looking forward to retirement for years, counting down paychecks until you'd have enough saved to start civilian life with a cushion, but you understand the anxiety they're describing. The salt that will carry you into retirement is saved carefully in multiple pouches, each one containing a measured amount that you've been accumulating through careful budgeting and controlled spending over the final years of your service. You have maybe 2 years' worth of expenses saved if you're frugal, maybe 1 year if you're not, maybe 3 if you find work quickly and don't have to live entirely on savings. It's not a fortune, but it's something proof that years of military service can translate into civilian security if you manage your pay carefully enough. What will you do with all that salt? Gaius asks, gesturing at the pouches arranged on your wooden chest. He's younger, still has years of service remaining, still thinks of salt primarily as something you spend rather than something you save. Trade it for whatever I need, you explain, though the answer feels inadequate for the question he's really asking, which is probably about how you transition from structured military life to whatever chaos civilian existence entails. Salt is still currency even after you leave the Legion. Maybe even better currency, actually, Because civilians don't have regular paydays, they have to manage their resources more carefully, which means they understand the value of salt in ways that soldiers getting regular wages sometimes don't. You've thought about this transition more than you've admitted to anyone, worried about it in the quiet hours when worry is easiest and sleep is hardest, tried to plan for contingencies you can't fully predict, because you've never experienced civilian life as an adult. The salt represents security, but also responsibility. No quartermaster will be distributing more next month if you run out. No bureaucratic system will automatically replenish your supply. Nothing but your own labor and planning will determine whether you have enough to survive. But you also have knowledge that most civilians don't have, understanding gained through years of experience with salt as both commodity and currency. You know how to judge salt quality, how to measure amounts precisely, how to preserve food properly, how to cook with salt in ways that maximize flavor while minimizing waste. You know the commercial networks, know which merchants are honest and which ones short their measures. You know seasonal price variations and trading routes, and all the invisible logistics that determine whether you're getting fair value in transactions. This knowledge is worth something, probably worth more than the salt itself in the long run, though it's harder to quantify or trade. But between the saved salt and the accumulated expertise, you feel reasonably confident about surviving the transition from military to civilian life, reasonably prepared for whatever comes next, even though the specifics remain uncertain. The fire burns down as you eat your final meal as a soldier, the flames reducing to coals that glow red in the darkness. The food tastes exactly like every other camp meal you've ever eaten, adequate, properly salted, designed for survival rather than enjoyment, but also different because it's the last one, because tomorrow you'll be cooking for yourself as a civilian rather than as a soldier, because this specific combination of ingredients and circumstances will never repeat. You think about the woman in the salt ponds who told you that her labor becomes your wage, about the tax collector who sees salt as fiscal policy made material, about the ship's crew who transported across seas where it might return to the ocean it came from, about all the people whose lives intersect with salt in ways that usually remain invisible, but that become visible when you pay attention. You've been part of that invisible network for years now, a node in the vast system that moves salt through the empire from producers to consumers, from coastal ponds to frontier garrisons, from labor to value to survival. Leaving military service doesn't disconnect you from that network. You'll still be buying salt and using salt and participating in the same commercial systems. But your role will change in ways you're only beginning to understand. That night, you lie in your bunk for the last time, listening to the familiar sounds of the garrison settling into sleep sentries, changing shifts, someone arguing about dice game debts, the distant sound of the camp's watchdog barking at nothing. Your pouches of salt are secured under your bedroll, heavy with the accumulated savings of years of careful budgeting, ready to carry you into whatever comes next. You take out a single grain of salt from one of the pouches, holding it up to the small amount of light filtering through the tent fabric. It's impossibly small, barely visible, would be easy to lose if you dropped it on the ground. but it contains everything you've learned about value and labor and empire, concentrated into a form so pure that it seems almost abstract, just a crystal, just sodium chloride, just salt. But not just anything, you realize. This grain of salt represents the ocean it came from, the worker who harvested it, the merchant who traded it, the ship that transported it, the quartermaster who distributed it, the years you spent earning it. It represents Rome's power to organize labor and extract taxes and move commodities across vast distances. It represents civilization itself, the human capacity to transform nature into culture, to take free seawater and create value through applied labor and knowledge. You place the grain on your tongue and let it dissolve slowly, paying complete attention to the process instead of just experiencing it unconsciously. The sharp taste, the flood of saliva, the chemical signals that tell your body something important just arrived. The crystal breaking down into solution, becoming part of you, joining the salt that's already in your blood and sweat and tears. The transformation from solid to liquid, from external to internal, from commodity to constituent of your own flesh. This is what salt does. You think it connects and transforms and preserves. It makes things possible that wouldn't otherwise be possible. It serves as currency and ingredient and chemical necessity simultaneously. And you've spent years being paid in it, years participating in systems you barely understood at first, but have come to see as the invisible architecture that holds empire together. Tomorrow you'll leave the garrison and begin civilian life, carrying your saved salt and your accumulated knowledge into an uncertain future. You don't know what work you'll find, don't know where you'll settle. I don't know how long your savings will last, or whether you'll thrive or merely survive in the transition from soldier to civilian. But you know about salt, know its value, know its uses, know the systems that move it through the world and the labor that makes it available. You know how to measure it precisely, how to trade it fairly, how to use it efficiently in ways that maximize survival and minimize waste. That knowledge, combined with the pouches of salt saved through years of discipline, gives you a foundation to build from, even if you can't predict exactly what you'll build. Sleep comes eventually, carrying you toward the first day of the rest of your life, towards civilian existence and all its challenges and possibilities. The salt remains under your bedroll, still heavy with potential, still capable of being transformed into whatever you need most: food or shelter or security, or simply more time to figure out what comes next. And somewhere far away, in salt ponds along the coast, workers are wading into brine to harvest more crystals under the same moon that's shining on your garrison, their hands turning white as they create the value that will eventually become someone else's pay, someone else's survival, someone else's connection to systems that span the empire and predate history. The cycle continues, with or without your participation, simply because it must and always has, and probably always will. You were part of it for years, and you'll continue being part of it in different ways, and the salt will keep flowing from ocean to land, to human use, and back to ocean again, in loops that connect everything to everything else, whether anyone notices or acknowledges it or not. This is the secret at the heart of Roman power, not military strength or engineering prowess or political organization, though all of those matter, but something simpler and more fundamental. The ability to move salt efficiently from producers to consumers, to transform labor into wages and wages into survival, to create systems that work at scales large enough to span continents and persist across centuries. You were paid in white gold, in crystallized ocean, in the same substance that a cook uses to flavor a stew, but that an empire uses to pay its armies and feed its cities and preserve its very existence. And now that knowledge is yours to keep, yours to use, yours to carry into whatever future awaits beyond these garrison walls and this final night as a soldier of Rome. 字数2093 Closing. The morning will come, as mornings do, bringing the first day of civilian life and all its uncertainties. But for now, you rest with salt under your bedroll and knowledge in your mind, ready to carry both forward into whatever comes next, knowing that you understand something fundamental about value and labor and the invisible threads that connect everyone in the empire, whether they realize it or not. The salarium continues, paid out to soldiers who will receive their white gold the same way you did for so many years, who will spend it and save it, and use it to survive in a world where survival is never guaranteed, but is at least made possible by systems that work whether anyone fully understands them or not. And somewhere in the dark, a single grain of salt is dissolving on a soldier's tongue, sharp and immediate and essential, carrying with it the weight of history and the promise of tomorrow and the quiet truth that this humble crystal, common as seawater, precious as life itself, is what built an empire and kept it building, one white grain at a time. 字数258